wanted more power. Arcade-like four-dimensional graphics and 15-channel stereo sound. Neo Geo. There's no stopping us now.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Player One Start. Today we're starting a new series on the channel, and that is the Ultimate Neo Geo Review. Now, to tell you the truth, this is actually the third series I'm doing in the 16-bit war. In the previous two series, I took a look at the Sega Genesis and the TurboGrafx 16. And in this war, we're going to have them face off with the Neo Geo and the Super Nintendo to see which one was better. But before we get too far into it, we have to take a look at the history of each system, and I've already done that in the Sega Genesis and TurboGrafx 16, and now it's the Neo Geo's turn. But the Neo Geo is not actually a 16-bit console. Believe it or not, it's actually listed as a 24-bit system, but the processor at the heart of it is a Motorola 68000, which is the same processor that was used in the Sega Genesis. So it actually fits in a bit more with this war than we think, not just technology-wise, but time frame-wise. It did directly compete with the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Sega Genesis, and the TurboGrafx 16, and eventually the Super Nintendo, so we have to include it in this war. Something else to be aware of is that this system is actually not just a home video game console, but it was a line of hardware that SNK decided to put out to kind of bridge the gap between the arcade experience and the home experience. But before we get too far into it, don't forget to click on that subscribe button and the bell icon to be notified when I make future posts in this series, as well as other videos. Also, if you liked today's video, before the end, don't forget to click a like button on your way out. That said, let's go ahead and start taking a look at this company, SNK, that really got its start in video games about the time that everyone else did. In July 1978 in Osaka, Japan, Akechi Kawasaki set up a new company called SNK Electronics Corp. SNK was short for Shin Nihon Kakeku, which roughly translates into New Japanese Project. The company's initial purpose was to design and produce software and hardware components for a variety of different business clients. Soon after the company was founded, noticing the rapid growth that was occurring in the coin-operated video game sector, Kawasaki expanded the company's endeavors to include the development and marketing of standalone coin-operated games. The first of the titles to come out of SNK's new coin-op division was Ozma Wars in 1979. This game was a vertically scrolling space shoot-'em-up game, similar to games that were burning up the arcades at the time, like Space Invaders. In the game, the player controls a spacecraft that must fend off UFOs, meteors, and comets. Instead of lives, the player is given an energy reserve that is constantly diminishing. Getting hit by the enemies causes gameplay to stop momentarily, and a large amount of energy is depleted. Energy can be restored when every so often a mothership appears and the player can dock with it. The game then endlessly cycles through 3 or 4 recognizable stages, and only ends when the player's energy reaches 0. A short side note about this game is that it was considered lost for many years, until the software developers of the SNK 40th Anniversary Collection ended up finding an old arcade machine and reprogrammed the game from scratch. This was because SNK did not have any source files or anything related to this time period of their company's history, as Ozma Wars was not a huge success. This game was only monochrome, but because it was also a conversion kit for Space Invaders, it was able to use the same color overlay that the Space Invaders arcade cabinet used. In 1980, SNK released their next arcade title, Safari Rally, which is a maze game that you drive through and collect dots. Today these titles are remembered for being noteworthy as SNK's first 2 games. However, back in the day, they were not received very well, and they were not a commercial success. However, things took a turn in 1981 when SNK released Vanguard, which is a side-scrolling space shoot-'em-up game that many people consider to be the grandfather of games such as Gradius and R-Type. Hoping that the success of Vanguard would translate well in North America, they licensed the game to Century for distribution, but ultimately started manufacturing and distributing the game itself when profits exceeded expectations. On October 20th of 1981, SNK Corporation of America was born. The company started out in a tiny office in Sunnyvale, California, with the intent of delivering its own unique brand of coin-operated games to arcades across all of America. The man chosen to run SNK's new North American operation was a man named John Rowe, who would go on to found Trade West and be the president and CEO of Sammy Studios. After the huge success of Vanguard, SNK shifted its focus solely towards the development and licensing of video games. Between 1979 and 1986, SNK produced a grand total of 23 standalone arcade games. Out of these games, the most successful was Akari Warriors. Released in 1986, gamers rushed to the arcades to experience the new style of shoot-'em-up, which took you out of the worn-out space shooter theme and put you in control of mercenaries battling it out against enemy soldiers in a jungle setting. At the time, movies like Rambo: First Blood Part 2 were making all of the money at the box office, and players seemed eager to spend their quarters mowing down soldiers, tossing grenades, and seeking cover in foxholes just like their heroes were doing on the silver screen. Evidence of the game's popularity can be seen in its many ports to the Atari 2600, Commodore 64, Commodore Amiga, NES, and other game consoles, along with 2 sequels. And although SNK had established itself in the arcades as a major player, many gamers would first become aware of SNK in the later 1980s when its games began to appear on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Executives at SNK realized that even though they were making good money in the arcades, there was definitely good money to be made on home systems as well. However, in the early part of the 1980s, the biggest barrier to entering the home video game market was the video game crash in 1983. Many of the major players were going bankrupt or shutting down their doors, and the game systems at the time were not really capable of producing an arcade game experience. However, this began to change with the introduction of the Nintendo Famicom in Japan and the Nintendo Entertainment System in the United States. Unlike games on previous systems, games on the Nintendo Entertainment System were able to get much closer to the arcade counterparts, and even spurred SNK to develop games original to the system. Even though the Nintendo Entertainment System would be much more powerful than the systems that preceded it, there were still limitations to what the home console could provide. Taking a look at the arcade version of Akari Warriors versus the NES port, you can see some of the sacrifices that had to be made because it is running on much less powerful hardware. First off, you'll notice that all blood is heavily censored in the game, and that's not necessarily a technical limitation, although I'm sure that helps that they don't have to animate all of that blood, but it was mainly a censorship practice that would mainly affect all Japanese games that transported over to the United States. The first, and I believe most obvious, graphical sacrifice they had to make was the number of enemies on screen are greatly reduced. Even still, when there's more than 3 or 4 enemies on screen, you'll notice that they start to flicker in and out. That is mainly because all of the characters on screen are drawn using sprites, and there's a limit on the NES on how many you can have on a screen, and an even smaller limit on how many you can have on each scan line on your TV. To get around this, a lot of software developers would make the sprites flicker in and out when the sprite limit was reached. But when you look at the arcade counterpart, there is almost no sprite flickering visible to the player. The characters and backgrounds are also much more detailed on the arcade version, as there's also a color limit on the Nintendo that is much more restricted than on the arcade hardware. However, despite these limitations, players were quite pleased with the results, and the game was a huge financial success for SNK. Due to the financial success of their arcade ports, and seeing an opportunity of making quality titles specifically from the ground up designed to run on the limited hardware, SNK started developing titles specifically for the Nintendo Entertainment System. 2 games that came out of this effort were 1989's Baseball Stars and 1990's Crystallis, which was known as Godslayer in Japan. Baseball Stars captivated players with its franchise-style hiring and trade features, which was a novelty back at that time. And Crystallis was SNK's answer to Nintendo's Legend of Zelda. It was an adventure-based RPG with a large overworld, tough bosses, and gorgeous cinematic cutscenes. But by 1989, the Nintendo Entertainment System was not the only home console that players had to choose from. Sega released their next generation of 16-bit hardware, the Sega Genesis, and NEC and Hudson Soft had released their version of the next generation system, known as the TurboGrafx 16. Along with these two systems came a huge competition which eventually evolved into what is known as the console wars of the early 1990s. Rather than choose sides in the war, SNK chose to refocus its efforts on the arcade market, leaving other third parties, such as Romstar and Takara, to license and port SNK's future properties to various home consoles of the time. However, the engineers at SNK had an idea on their hands that would revolutionize the arcade industry and potentially mean millions upon millions of dollars in revenue for the company. That idea would eventually evolve into a hybrid arcade and home console system simply known as Neo Geo.
So, probably like many of you out there, I first heard of SNK in their releases on the Nintendo Entertainment System. In fact, if you look over at my shelves here, you can probably spot at least one or two of SNK's titles on there. The strange thing is, when I was doing this review, I actually forgot about all of the games that I had on the NES, and I decided to go back through and play a few of these because it's been a while, and I honestly fell in love with these games all over again. So if you haven't played the games on the Nintendo Entertainment System, I definitely recommend giving those a shot. Some of them are included in the SNK 40th Anniversary Collection, which is out now, at least for the Nintendo Switch as of the making of this video, but I think playing them on original hardware, as with any game, provides a much better experience.
NEOGEO World!救出せよ、破壊せよ。Go! 46メガ。The future is now SNK.
We are actually going to take a look at the development of two lines of hardware that SNK would release in the Neo Geo family. First, they released the MVS, or Multi-Video System. This was going to be Neo Geo's answer to standardizing arcade hardware. Before this, most video game systems in the arcade were built around the games they were supposed to be releasing on that hardware. In other words, if you wanted a game that could do 3D, you had to build a different set of hardware to handle the 3D. If you wanted to build a shooter, if you wanted to build a racing game, there were all different hardware that you had to build. But Neo Geo wanted to save cost by making all of the common components available and just swapping out the necessary pieces of hardware to make each game different. So that's where the multi-video system comes in, and that was really revolutionary for the arcade, at least in the late 1980s. Let's go ahead and take a look.
The Neo Geo hardware was an evolution of an older SNK/Alpha Denshi M68000 arcade platform that was used in Time Soldiers in 1987. This arcade hardware was further developed in Prisoners of War in 1988 using a similar structure but slightly improved. Unlike other popular arcade hardware of the time, this unit used sprite strips instead of the more common tiled map-based backgrounds. This gave the game developers a lot more control over what was displayed on the screen and how much you can have moving at one time. For example, many games could take advantage of parallax scrolling in ways that other arcade platforms could not. Integral to development of the Neo Geo hardware was Eiji Fukatsu, who oversaw development of new features such as adding sprite scaling through the use of scaling tables stored in ROM, as well as support for much higher amounts of data on cartridges and better sound hardware. Another key developer of this hardware was Takashi Nishiyama, who came over to SNK after developing a game called Street Fighter for Capcom in 1987. It was Nishiyama who proposed the concept of an arcade system that uses ROM cartridges like a game console, which would save SNK a lot of money in production costs, which would help make the system cheaper for markets such as China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and in areas where it was difficult to sell dedicated arcade hardware because of game piracy. He would also propose a home version of the arcade hardware to further drive down costs. Nishiyama would also be involved in some of the biggest games on the platform, creating the Fatal Fury game franchise as a spiritual successor to the original Street Fighter. He would also work on other franchises on the Neo Geo, such as The Art of Fighting, The King of Fighters, as well as the run-and-gun shooter series, Metal Slug. The Neo Geo hardware would be officially announced on January 31st, 1990, in Osaka, Japan. And upon the release of the arcade cabinet, it was well received by arcade operators. The main benefit of having an MVS cabinet was the fact that they were able to save on some much-needed space by having a single cabinet for multiple games. The MVS would come in 2, 4, and 6 slot systems that would allow gamers to pick which games they wanted at the title screen. The Neo Geo arcade cabinets used the same 4-button and joystick combination that the home cabinet would have, only these would be mounted into the arcade cabinet case. The cartridges used in the MVS system would look and operate a little bit different than the home version to keep arcade operators from trying to buy the cheaper AES cartridges. Unlike their home version counterparts, the cartridges for the MVS would not contain beautiful artwork or fancy labels, as they were not designed to be viewed being hidden inside of the arcade cabinet. In Japan, SNK used the candy cab layout, which allowed the machines to be smaller, lighter, and way less than their American counterparts. This style of cabinet is normally lined in long uniform rows, allowing for each person to have their own screen and controls. Playing against each other is achieved by networking cabinets together. In North America, Neo Geo games were normally housed in red stand-up cabinets, branded with the Neo Geo logo. Because the cabinet could house multiple games but only run one at a time, usually there was not specialized artwork on the side of each cabinet, but in the marquee there were removable flyers that would show which games were available on this machine. The cabinets in North America would also support headphones and a memory card, something that made the MVS unique, as you could save your games between the arcade and take it home and play it on the AES version. These cabinets would have 2 4-button controls as well as 2 joysticks for player 1 and player 2, and the buttons in all of these arcade cabinets would follow a standardized color scheme, where A was always red, B was yellow, C was green, and D was blue. This is also how any in-game graphics would show the control panel when displaying how to play a game. Today, you do not have to buy a Neo Geo in its whole arcade cabinet form. Many tech hobbyists have made them into what's known as a consoleized version, which allows you to hook it up to standard home equipment such as other game console controllers and a consumer-based CRT. Some have also offered this as a service, offering their own version of the MVS, such as this example, the Omega Entertainment System. Although it is designed to look like an AES, this system only natively accepts MVS cartridges.
Again, creating a hardware system that had interchangeable cartridges was kind of a revolutionary idea for the arcades, but SNK really wants to revolutionize the home industry and make it that much closer to providing an arcade experience at home by letting you have the arcade hardware at home. Let's go ahead and take a look at the Advanced Entertainment System.
The Neo Geo AES, or Advanced Entertainment System, was released in Japan on April 26, 1990. At first, the AES home system was only available for rent at commercial establishments, such as hotel chains, bars, and restaurants. However, when SNK realized that some gamers were willing to buy a $650 game console, SNK expanded sales and marketing into the home console market in 1991. Unlike the purely functional design of the MVS hardware, the Neo Geo AES was designed in a slim, black-shelled console imprinted with gold and white letters. The game cartridges themselves would also receive an aesthetic upgrade, having the same glossy black plastic on their shells, along with providing some beautiful artwork to be able to tell games apart from each other. Unlike MVS cartridges, which came usually in just plastic sleeves or cardboard boxes, AES cartridges would come in soft plastic shells or in printed cardboard boxes. Instead of including battery-backed saved options in each cartridge, Neo Geo opted to provide a memory card, which is the first home system to do so. The reasoning behind adding this card is the fact that you could actually Start a game in the arcade, save your progress, and continue it at home, and vice versa. Because the Neo Geo's hardware is standardized across both systems, this provides the same exact graphics and sound as you would see in the arcade, which provided players with a highly superior gaming experience when compared to other home game consoles, arcades, and even computers of the time. The Neo Geo AES officially launched in the United States on July 1st, 1991, with a debut price of $649.99, but it would include 2 joystick controllers and a game, either Baseball Stars Professional or NOM 1975. And although you may think that that's just a bit higher than game consoles being launched today with the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, the equivalent of $649 in 1991 is $1,235 as of 2020. The game console will be later bundled with Magician Lord and Fatal Fury, but those were all sold as the Gold system. Eventually, there would be a Silver system package that would launch at $399, include 1 joystick controller, and no pack-in game. Other games were also available at launch at about $200 a pop and up, which was over double to quadruple the price of the competition. However, SNK knew that they would only be selling this system in games to a small market. But thanks to its full compatibility between the arcade system and the home system, little to no money was being spent on porting or marketing of the AES, since the MVS success was automatically feeding the AES market, which made the console very profitable for SNK. As the Neo Geo AES was meant to be hooked up to a home TV, the controllers were not built into the console, but they were actually faithful duplicates of the arcade controls in a larger format. Due to the bulkiness of the controllers, you would have to keep them on your lap or on a counter of some sort, rather than being able to hold the controller in your hands. Also, in order to match the aesthetic of the home console, the colored buttons are gone in favor of a plain gray design, but each one of them are clearly marked with which one they represent. I appreciate that these are not labeled directly on the buttons because it would have worn off by now. Just judging by where people's palms were resting on the end of this controller, you can see the Neo Geo logo is clearly being worn off. This is not the only controller you could use with the Neo Geo system, however, as you can see with this custom controller that I got from a person online. These controllers are actually more consistent with a Sega 6-button controller and the controllers they would use on the Neo Geo CD unit, which, although not a major part of this review, I should mention it as a line in this family of systems as well. The Neo Geo CD system was released on September 9th of 1994 in Japan and didn't make its way over to the United States until January 15th of 1996. In terms of the hardware driving this system, it is set up almost exactly the same as the AES and the MVS units, with the big difference being that it has a CD-ROM drive instead of a cartridge slot, which would allow SNK to charge cheaper prices with the cheaper format of compact discs. In this line of systems, there were 3 different variations produced, the first being a front-loading version that had the CD tray that would pop out and was only distributed in Japan. There would be a top-loading version that was released worldwide, and there would be a 3rd edition called the Neo Geo CD-Z, which upgraded the read speed of the CD-ROM drive, allowing for faster loading times. This version is the one most coveted by collectors today, and as such it is the most expensive variant. As the discs are region-free, you can take advantage of this system if you get the right power adapter and a display that can work with it. When looking at the entire Neo Geo family of systems, there are about 158 officially licensed games released, with most of them being available for the multi-video system, and the selection decreases as you go to the other 2 platforms. All in all, it is this entire line of systems that represents the Neo Geo completely. All of these systems share the same basic hardware and play almost exactly the same games in the same way. The main difference between all these units are where they were intended to be used and the media you use with them. There's actually no other hardware line of systems that could match what the Neo Geo did in the early 1990s, as all other manufacturers used separate hardware in the arcades than they did at home. However, other game consoles, such as the Nintendo 64 and the Sega Dreamcast, would share some hardware components between their arcade systems and home version counterparts to make game porting a bit easier. But neither one of those systems could play the same games natively. There was some sort of porting process that would have to take place to get the game to run between their arcade and home hardware.
Neo Geo, SNK's foresight to create a product using state-of-the-art technology and positive marketing ideas. This refined sensibility and cutting-edge technology have been fused together to create the ultimate in amusement entertainment, which now provides the world with limitless pleasure.
The most unique part of the Neo Geo's hardware that separates it from its competition is the technology that went into it. This console is packed with the best technology that the late 1980s and early 1990s would have to offer. Let's go ahead and look under the hood.
Taking a look inside of the Neo Geo at the motherboard, you can tell where some of the expense of this console came from, as the more chips you see on the board, usually the more expensive the machine is. The Neo Geo AES actually has two hearts controlling everything. First is the main Motorola 68000 12MHz CPU, which was capable of executing 16 or 32-bit instructions. Alongside of that was a Zilog Z80 running at 4 MHz, capable of executing 8 and 16-bit instructions, but it was mainly used for sound control. If you add up all of the RAM available on the board, it comes out to around 214 kilobytes of static RAM. 64 kilobytes are available to the Motorola 68000, spread across two separate 32 kilobyte banks. The Zilog Z80 also has 2 kilobytes of static RAM, mainly used again for sound. The rest of the RAM is spread across the graphics GPU chipset, with again 64K being available for main video RAM, with the palette memory and fast video sprite RAM being available as well. On the right hand side of this board you can see the memory card slot is available, which would allow you to have a memory card which had battery back save RAM that could be used by the console when it was inserted. The board contains 512 kilobytes of onboard read-only memory chips. One of them is the zoom lookup table, which was used for scaling of sprites. Another one was used for fixed layer graphics. Another chip held standard sound information for the Z80 chip. And then finally there was the BIOS chip, which the 68000 would execute to start the hardware. What gave the Neo Geo its advanced graphics was its GPU chipset, which consisted of a few custom SNK chips, the first one being the line sprite generator, which ran at 24 MHz. The other chips controlled the color palette used on screen as well as other features, and it's actually the GPU graphics data bus where the system gets its 24 bits namesake. With the other two consoles prominently featuring their bits in either their name or in their marketing, it is no wonder that SNK's marketing decided to include this higher number as a way for consumers to immediately tell that there was something more to this system over their competitors. But it would take more than a number of bits to woo customers over to this platform, especially at its high price. All the hardware packed inside this system is useless if it doesn't produce a good image. So let's see what kind of advantages this hardware provides. The Neo Geo outputs a display resolution of 320 by 224, however many games run at a slightly smaller resolution than that. The console is capable of progressive scan if you use an adapter interface that is capable of displaying that type of image. On-screen graphics are drawn from a color palette of 65,536 colors, with the maximum number of colors visible on screen being around 4096. The way the colors are drawn on the screen is that there are two banks, one of them being used at a time, each of 256 palettes that are available. Each palette has 16 color entries, the first of which being transparent, and the other 15 being real colors. It is the expanded color palette that allows backgrounds and sprites to have much more detail than what would be seen on other systems. Sprite tiles can use any of the 256 palettes available, while fixed tiles can only use the first 16, but tile graphics would be mainly used in the background. Whenever you see objects moving on the screen, most likely that image is a sprite. Sprites are the building blocks of all of your characters on screen, enemies, and yourself, as well as your weapons and your items. The Neo Geo is capable of showing 380 sprites on screen at a time, with a maximum of 96 per scan line. Sprites must be at least 16 pixels tall by 16 pixels wide, however you could make smaller objects by just adding in some transparent pixels. However, sprites could have a maximum size larger than the actual screen. You'll see why in a little bit. Tile maps or backgrounds were made out of one static layer, which could be drawn wider than the actual viewable area of the screen, but unlike other home game systems at the time, the Neo Geo has 3 different sprite planes, which allowed game developers to make more interactive backgrounds using sprites. The most notable example of this is parallax scrolling, where certain parts of the screen scroll faster to give the illusion of depth in an image. Large sprites can also be chained together to make objects that function similarly to tiled map backgrounds. These sprite chains can then be moved side to side or up and down depending on where they need to be drawn, in contrast to different sprite layers or to the background itself. This gives the overall image on screen an illusion of depth, making it look a bit more 3D even though it's using 2D sprites. Here's an example of a game that not only uses parallax scrolling but also sprite scaling, which was something that home consoles were lacking at least up until this point and through most of this generation. Take a look at the trees that show up on either the right or left hand side of the screen and you'll see that they are giving the illusion of being surrounded on either side with tall trees. The Neo Geo initially came with an RF output adapter, however you can also use composite and RCA audio. If you had the gear that supported it, you could also get RGB with a separate 21-pin cable or the European standard RGB SCART cable. On the console that I own, I am using the standard composite and mono audio output that was included with my system. I do have a little adapter cable which will split off the mono audio so it plays through both speakers, but it will not give me the illusion of stereo surround sound. And while we're on the topic of video output, I am going to note that I used 2 different methods of capturing video footage for this review video. I started playing games by capturing through emulation, which natively outputs at 1080p, but during the production of this video I was able to secure a composite HDMI upscaler which does an excellent job producing a clear image that looks crisp and is played on original hardware. So note that because I started production on this video before I got that upscaler, you will see both emulated gameplay footage as well as gameplay captured from original hardware using this upscaler. If you look closely, you can see some minor visual differences between the 2 capture methods. Moving on to sound, I did note that the sound is controlled by the Z80 CPU, but the actual sound synthesis takes place in the Yamaha YM2610 sound chip. To help interface these 2 chips, there is a custom Neo D0 chip, which also handles joypad outputs and the memory card bank selects. The sound chip has about 2 kilobytes of working RAM, but it also includes about 128 kilobytes of onboard sound ROM, and the sound chip could also access up to 512 kilobytes of sound ROM on the cartridges. This chip was able to produce a variety of different waveforms for a total of 14 channels of sound. In order to utilize all of these channels, there is an additional chip, the YM3016, which acts as a digital to analog converter chip to facilitate the FM and ADPCM sounds. Let's take a look and listen to an example of a song from the Neo Geo hardware.
Metal Slug. Mission 1, start. Heavy machine gun.
As you can see on the screen, not all of the channels are being used for the song. This would allow the Neo Geo to play sound effects of anything happening on screen without cutting out any part of the song, which is something that was common on previous hardware. The remaining channels are being used for things that wouldn't usually be seen on a home console, such as digitized speech. Along with that, I think all of the channels are utilized well and provides a high quality sound, at least higher quality than what I would see on another home console of this era. To get a better idea of how the graphics and sound were used on this system, let's go ahead and take a look at a few more examples from this console.
Thank you. Heavy machine gun.
Hole number 1, 460 yards. Par 4.
Player 1, tee shot.
Good shot.
Fairway. Player 1, second shot.
Fine.
On the green.
Ready, go!
ライオンヘッよっよっこうってなくてハワーショートオッケーこう
Out of all of the games that were released for this system, I think I find Pulsar one of the most impressive looking. Now obviously there are more games I have to try for this, but as with any system, we may have to go to the tech demo scene to see what the maximum capability of this system is. As we take a look at some of these tech demos, I will note that I am pulling these from the MVS, the AES, and the Neo Geo CD, as they all share very similar hardware. Let's go ahead and take a look. So one of the things I did not mention about the Neo Geo's graphics is that 3D objects are not really capable of being rendered on the system, at least in theory. As you can tell, some of these programmers have taken great care to animate 3D objects on the screen, but you would not have seen this in any of your video games on the Neo Geo console. It is a bit beyond me how they are accomplishing this, but if I had to make an educated guess, I would say that they are using animated sprites to somehow get these objects to appear like they're 3D animated polygons. It should be noted that all of the tech demos you are seeing were rendered in emulation. That is mainly due to the fact that all of these were designed to run on the Neo Geo CD, so I couldn't get them up and running on my AES. Before we move on from the demos, there is one that I always like to show, as it is one that has been ported to a variety of systems, so we can tell just how capable each piece of hardware was. The musical and graphical sequence is the same one used in all of the bad Apple tech demos that I showcased in the 8-bit war. However, now that it is running on much more capable hardware, everything looks and sounds better than it did on the previous generation. One of the side effects of the fact that the music quality is much better is the fact that I can't play it in this video or else it gets flagged. But needless to say, it does sound excellent taking advantage of the sound hardware on the Neo Geo. Overall, this demo is very well done. But again, nothing you would see on a store-bought cartridge. The cartridges on the Neo Geo have many unique features that I have not seen on any other console before or since. First is the actual size of the cartridge. These are, without a doubt, the largest game cartridges I've ever handled in person in my life. I'm not quite sure if there's any that are bigger than this, and if there are, you'll have to let me know in the comments. But these things are big, especially when you compare them to every other game cartridge in my collection. If you set them up just right, you can't even tell there are any other games behind this cartridge, as the Neo Geo cartridge eclipses every other game. But I believe this is due to the fact that there is a lot more in these cartridges than are in the typical game cartridge of the time period. Taking a look inside, you can see there are two separate boards that connect into the system. There are many different cartridge layouts, so this is just one example, but all of them will contain some sort of ROM chip to contain the game code. There are other system enhancement chips that would be included, but these vary by game to game. Here are some examples of other chips besides the ROMs themselves that would be included in some of these cartridges. I am not an expert on these, so I can't tell you exactly what each of these do, with the exception of the microcontroller that was put on multiplayer cartridges, which I assume allowed them to communicate with each other. Another iconic feature of the Neo Geo was its startup screen, that would always boot up and say that it had a max of 330 mega pro gear spec. Many of the earliest titles would not reach this mark, however when they were over 100 megabits, some of them would also show a screen saying the 100 megashock. Before the end of the system's lifecycle, there would be advancements made to allow bank switching that would make the maximum capacity of each cartridge go up quite a bit, and there would be another boot up screen for those that would say Gigapower on the boot up screen.
The Neo Geo AES is one of those systems that I think is one of the holy grails of collecting. For the time frame that I grew up in, which was 1980s, 1990s, this is the pinnacle of a console that I would have loved to have had up until about the time that the Sony PlayStation came out. I mean, this thing is really packed and loaded and so much more capable than every other system around it. One of the problems of this system back in the day was its high cost. And to tell you the truth, that's still the problem with this system today, because it was expensive to buy back in the day, there aren't as many of these consoles out there as a result because they didn't sell as many, and they are a high collector's item today because the graphics and sound are exactly what you would see in an arcade machine out of that time.
Perhaps there are some people who are not familiar with the company name SNK. SNK produces and sells the coin-operated Neo Geo hardware and software, as well as the Neo Geo home entertainment system. Our home system holds the same power and capabilities as our coin-operated machines.
SNK, up until this point, had been a big name in gaming in Japan. However, the North American audience was not as familiar with this brand, except for, as I previously mentioned, with their NES titles. SNK's initial plan to break into the home market was actually to only offer a home system available for rent. This system would be considered prohibitively expensive, as it would have all of the arcade hardware that the major arcade machines would have. The Neo Geo was announced on January 31st, 1990 in Osaka, Japan, and was released on April 26, 1990. It was around this time that news of a new gaming console from this company had started reaching North American gamers through North American gaming publications. Looking through issues of Electronic Gaming Monthly at this time, there are sporadic articles about this mysterious system coming over from Japan. This article mentions that the Neo Geo will provide an experience unlike any other console that is currently out on the market, but for a system that would provide such a vastly different gaming experience, it didn't really receive a lot of press coverage. The fact that it was very easy to port Neo Geo games from the arcade systems to the home system allowed the AES to have a large and varied game library at launch. This wasn't really typical because usually there wouldn't be very many games available when the system would be released, due to the time it would take to create games specific for the platform. The Neo Geo AES made its debut at the 1991 Summer CES show. The systems were shown off to the press, however some gaming journalists had noted that the system was extremely hard to get, partially due to its high price points before the system would be released. It was also here where people would be officially informed about the tech specs and the capabilities of the Neo Geo, marketing it as a 24-bit system. In previous publications I had seen this thing listed all over the map, as a 16-bit system or even a 32-bit system. But despite what this console would offer, it seemed that many did not take it very seriously due to the high price point. The Advanced Entertainment System would offer many features that were not present in other consoles of the time, but I can only imagine that gaming journalists were wondering why on earth would they release a system that is 3 times the cost of its competition. This was also the same CES where the Super Nintendo would be unveiled to the North American public. The TurboGrafx would show how it was still trying to stay in the game, and the Sega Genesis was just starting to take off. Evidence of this can be found around the same time in the Electronic Gaming Monthly comments section, in which gamers are complaining that the price point is way too high. It is actually at this point where coverage of the Neo Geo is actually not very strong, at least in the printed materials of the time. The Neo Geo only becomes mentioned by gamers as this dream system that they wish they could afford, or they wish they could get if they had the money, but very few people thought they would ever own one. SNK, though, only expected the system to be sold to a niche market, only appealing to those that could afford this system and wanted the latest and greatest. The system would end up launching on July 1st, 1991 here in North America, and it would have a large launch library to go with it, with games from a variety of genres that would appeal to most players. The system at launch would have one of 2 pack-in games. The first one would be NAM 1975, and the other title would be Baseball Stars Professional.
Now in this part of the video, I was planning to show you what a typical boxed Neo Geo AES title looks like. The problem is, when I posted this picture online of my Neo Geo AES cart, I found out that, well, my copy may not be a typical example.
Let's go ahead and take a look at NAM 1975, which is the game that I got with my console. Now I will note that the NAM 1975 box art that I have here is not original to the system. In fact, if you look closely, not sure how well this shows up on camera, you can tell that somebody has photocopied this box art off of some sort of online source. Even still, if you look at the back, you may see this Neo Geo Freak reference on the bottom. First off, it may be obvious this box art is a reproduction because the fact that this game released in 1991, and this has a World Wide Web address which wouldn't be used until 1992. Looking at the web address and seeing the name Neo Geo Freak, you may wonder, well, what is that company name? Are they associated with SNK? Did they re-release some Neo Geo games in the future? That's why this box art's been modified? Honestly, that's what I thought, and I didn't really think anything of it until I posted this image online. If you go to this website as of the making of this video, you get this strange landing page that has no links on it that you can get to. So I decided to do some research into this mysterious company and find out why this version of the case box art exists with this company name on it. From what I was able to find out, it appears that Neo Geo Freak was a company consisting of about 2 people who decided in the mid-2000s to start repackaging and distributing unsold inventory of SNK stock of Neo Geo AES titles. I soon discovered that many Neo Geo collectors that are very passionate about collecting for this system really don't like the Neo Geo Freak editions of these games. And that is mainly due to their practice of destroying original box art to repackage them with reprinted box art, including the manuals as well. During the process of repackaging, Neo Geo Freak would make corrections to poor translations in game manuals and the box art, as well as redesign them to fit the later style of Neo Geo games, so everything would look uniform when you started collecting all of the games. So I can see why many would be upset with this process, as they are literally destroying gaming history as they are repackaging games. According to a lawsuit I was able to find, including Neo Geo Freak, it appears that SNK authorized Neo Geo Freak to do this as an official partner of SNK. However, many gamers who collected the Neo Geo Freak box art repackagings suspected that the games were being pirated or bootlegged in one way, shape, or form. Sadly, I was not able to find a lot of information about this, so whether or not this is true is still up in the air to me. But this does raise a point about when you collect games for the Neo Geo. The Neo Geo collecting market is filled with fakes, bootlegs, and reproduced box art. It was only after it was pointed out to me that my box art was not original that I investigated further to find out that the box art had been photocopied. However, when looking at the game manual and comparing it with known original sources of the game manual, it appears my manual is authentic and original to what would have been packaged in here. So if this is a Neo Geo Freak repackaging, the manual should also have been corrected as well. My suspicion is, at some point in time, someone decided to reproduce the box art and try to sell this game as authentic and complete in box. However, since I knew that this was not the original box art style, I took that into account when making my offer to buy this game. After some more investigating, I am convinced I do have an original AES copy of the cartridge as well, so at least that part is authentic. Due to the high price of collecting Neo Geo games in general, and even more so the fact that they are more expensive than that to collect them complete in box, I can only say that this is the only example I have of a complete in box game that I can showcase for this video. Due to the high expense of AES games and the low expense of NVS games, as well as these readily available 161-in-1 carts, I decided to use one of these adapters with a 161 NVS cart to play games on this system that I wouldn't normally be able to afford. And because I was never able to get that cartridge to work reliably on my system, I decided to go ahead and get this Neo SD cart to be able to load up any game that I wanted to play for this system. This is accomplished by loading games onto a micro SD card and then inserting it into the cartridge. The cartridge then acts as the game, allowing you to flash the memory inside of the cartridge, and the system recognizes it as a regular game. Unlike the NVS multi-cart, I am also able to load on any games that are not included in that collection. This allows for homebrew and even tech demos to be loaded on if you can get it to run on your system. There is a version of this cartridge that will allow you to play Neo Geo CD titles on the AES, but that is not the edition that I have here. Getting back to the launch though, I decided to go ahead and start with NOM 1975, as that was the first game I popped into the system, and it would have been many people's first game, as it was a pack-in title available at the launch of the console.
Summer 1975. A nightmare awaits me. I am being recalled to Torm headquarters. Do I have to go back to the hell again?
Upon booting the game, this title is already living up to what you want to see in a launch title. There are several different features available on this console that are featured in the opening screen. The first off was voice acting, which is something that was very seldom seen due to the large space required to store the samples. The voice playback is also much clearer than what we were getting on the 8-bit Nintendo Entertainment System. There was also scaling of what looked like background pictures, but they were most likely made out of sprites. This game is a shooter, but it's played in the point of view of a gallery arcade shooter. The story is set in a very fictionalized account of the final months of the Vietnam War. The story follows the soldiers Silver and Brown as they enter into the war once again to rescue an ex-military army scientist and his daughter Nancy, who are kidnapped and presumably imprisoned in the interior of Vietnam by the North Side terrorists. The screen will automatically scroll to the areas where you need to go, and you can only move your player from right to left on the screen. To help control where you aim on the screen, while you're firing, your player will stop moving. This led me into some incredibly frustrating areas of the game, where I needed to move out of the way of obstacles and continue to shoot. Enemies are constantly firing at you, and there are several that you need to be constantly firing back at. And I did find this to be the most challenging aspect of the gameplay. In terms of graphics, I do notice that the sprite animations are very fluid, as they're able to have more animation frames than what would have been standard on cartridges of the time. For me, this and all of the digitized speech added into the game is where this game is using all of its megabit glory. Overall, I did find this game entertaining, and I did like the fact that it was a different type of shooter than I'm used to playing. However, I couldn't help but wish that this would be a light gun shooter instead. I've never been a fan of playing light gun shooters with a joystick, and this is what this really reminds me of. Reviews of the time of this game were mostly positive, with reviewers noting the advanced graphics and clear digitized speech, but many were critical of the advanced difficulty. Retrospective reviews of this game have also been positive, with reviewers praising the gameplay but criticizing its short length. I've seen a lot of reviews for this game be around 8 or 9 out of 10, but I would give it around a 7 out of 10 personally. Overall, not a bad introduction to this system.
Information from headquarters. new strategy. Contact Allied plane and invade by parachute.
Dynamic! Baseball Stars Professional!
Baseball Stars Professional is a baseball arcade video game that was originally developed and published by SNK on April 26, 1990. It is the follow-up to the original Baseball Stars on the Nintendo Entertainment System. This game plays very similarly to the other Baseball Stars titles, where players compete in matches against computer-controlled opponents or other players across two different ballparks. There are only two modes featured in this game. Tournament is the main single-player mode, where one player must compete against CPU-controlled opponents in a season, and there's also Versus, which, as the name implies, is a two-player mode, where two people can compete against each other. And in my opinion, that is the best way to play this game, as playing against the computer I find is often one-sided, almost as if this game was designed to eat quarters in an arcade. Most of the original teams featured in the first Baseball Stars return in this game, although some features from the first game were removed for a more arcade-style approach of the sport. If you insert a memory card into either the MVS or the AES, players are allowed to save their progress and jump into their last match saved at a later time. This game received mixed reception from critics when it was originally released, with some reviewers praising various aspects of the gameplay, such as its presentation, visuals, and the quality of digitized voice samples, but many were divided when it came to the actual playing of the game. Review scores of this game are all over the map from several publications, with some game reviewers rating it at 8 out of 10, and others rating it at 2 out of 10. It really is all over the map, but for me personally, since there's not a huge draw for me personally as I'm not a big baseball fan, and I don't have the most nostalgia for this game after playing it on the NES, so I am more inclined to get this a 5 or a 6 out of 10. It's playable, but I think the CPU opponent is incredibly difficult.
It's out of here!
It's well back in the stand. It's a homer out of here. The crowd is going crazy. And as he rounds the bases, he loves to egg that crowd on. And proud he should be. He hit that ball a country mile. He just loves to hit homers here in this park.
Something that helped the Neo Geo AES at console launch here in the US was the fact that, a year earlier, the MVS and AES had launched in Japan, and due to the easy porting process between the two systems, it allowed SNK the ability to offer a variety of launch titles, more so than you would see at other systems of the time. We're going to take a look at the rest of the games that were available at launch for consumers to add to their library if they had the money to do so. As there are so many launch titles, I decided to go ahead and review these by genre, starting with the run and guns and shooters. The most unique of which I found was Cyberlip. In this game, you make your way through a variety of side-scrolling stages, battling through large numbers of enemies, collecting power-ups, and defeating several end-stage bosses. You can pick up more powerful weapons across your gameplay, however, you must conserve the ammunition as they are not unlimited. One part of the gameplay I found a bit annoying is that at the end of each stage, you have to decide whether you're going to go up or down in an elevator, and choosing the wrong choice, which seems to be random, will send you through a dangerous sublevel before you can proceed to the next stage. After you pass through all of the stages, you'll be presented with a computer room with 8 doors, which randomly determine which of the previous 6 bosses you will face. There is also another ammunition room, and finally the room to face Cyberlip itself. Overall, I found this game to be just okay. I didn't really get too bored of it, but I also didn't enjoy it to the point where I'd say that everybody needs to play this game. I definitely found the inability to shoot diagonally or even down when jumping to be downright cruel, especially when the enemies in the game can do it. My overall rating of this game is that I give it a 6 out of 10, which is just barely passable. However, I've seen reviews of this game go from the lower 3s to the upper 7s. Needless to say, it kinda depends on whether or not you're gonna like this one.
Let's roll!
Ready, go!
Alpha Mission 2 is a vertically scrolling full-screen shoot-'em-up released by SNK, and as the name suggests, it's the sequel to the 1985 arcade game, of which I had only played its port on the NES, and I enjoyed that quite thoroughly. And I have to say, after playing the NES version, I definitely prefer the Neo Geo version, as it provides that arcade upgrade that this game was sorely lacking on the NES. In this game, you play as a fighter spacecraft that can shoot enemies in the air, bomb enemies on the ground, and collect power-ups to defeat bosses and advance through different levels. Overall, this provides a solid experience, and I think it would be best enjoyed by those that actually enjoy these scrolling shooters, but even if you don't enjoy these, this will also provide you with a solid gaming experience. But as with all space shooters, be prepared for a bit of a challenge. Overall, I give this game about an 8 out of 10, and that rating falls right within the middle of other reviewers I've seen rate this game, somewhere between a 6 out of 10 and a 9 out of 10. The Super Spy is probably one of the most unique titles I've seen on this system. It offers a first-person perspective, and it allows you to go through side-scrolling sections, and even every once in a while going through like a 3D tunnel. But it's in these 3D tunnel sections where you can obviously tell that they are faking the 3D. To tell you the truth, I decided to go ahead and name this in with the shooters, but it's more of like a hack-and-slash game, as the weapons that you get in this game that can shoot often have limited ammo. Most of the time, I thought the gameplay reminded me of things like Mike Tyson's Punch-Out!, where you have to have reflex challenges and you have to duck and dodge, as well as hit and kick. Overall, I found this game fun for about the first 10 to 15 minutes, but it got boring really quick as the gameplay doesn't really evolve the farther you move into the game. And once I saw there were 16 floors to the second level, I decided to check out after about an hour of playing. I'd rank this at about a 5 out of 10, and I've seen review scores go anywhere between a 4 out of 10 and an 8 out of 10, so your experience may vary from my experience. Out of all the shooter games that launched with this system, I think my favorite has to be Ghost Pilots. This is a vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up game, with gameplay that reminds me a lot of games like Capcom's 1942. Again, this plays like a typical vertical scrolling shooter, so if you're into these kind of games, this is something you might want to pick up. Overall, I gave this about an 8 out of 10, even though I've seen review scores go from 5 out of 10 to 9 out of 10. Again, the reviewers seem to be all over the board with this one.
Ghost Pilots, for me, was a special treat on this system. I think this one's going to be probably my favorite out of the launch lineup even. This game is a solid vertically scrolling shooter. I found myself playing this almost all the way through in one sitting. I just could not put it down. And I think that's something where if you like scrolling shooters, this is another typical example of a good one. I think they hit it out of the park right at the gate. And for a game system that's mainly known for fighters, I think this game system's actually going to be known for shooters as well, at least for me, because a lot of other game systems at the time, like the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, really tried to mimic these early shooters, and they all have some sort of issue. Either they suffer from slowdown, couldn't have as many enemies on the screen, or, they had some sort of limitation. This game doesn't, and this really puts me back into the days when I was in the arcade and I would play these games. So the fact that they're less restricted, I think makes this a better experience for me personally, a person who likes these shooters, than they would on any other system.
Next up are the beat 'em up, and I guess the one fighting game that was released at launch. I find that a bit odd considering how many fighting games would be released before the end of the system's life. The first of which I'm going to look at is Ninja Combat, and this one is a huge pass for me. In terms of side-scrolling beat-em-ups, I found this one to be subpar and mediocre. Since this game's release, reviewers have been critical of the game's short length, easy difficulty, and repetitive gameplay, but for me I just found the game unremarkable and boring. When gamers rediscovered this title on the Wii, they gave it a very low score. I've seen 2 out of 10 to 4 out of 10 for this title, and I would say I have to agree with that. It just seems to me that the game was poorly executed. Given the game's stiff control and poor hit detection, I would say to avoid this one at all costs. Sengoku, on the other hand, is a title I enjoyed very much. But not really because it offers anything groundbreaking. I think that the subject matter and the art style and the plot of this game is a bit more unique than games I played of this genre at the time. Again, I've seen game reviewers give this around a 5 or a 6 out of 10, and I might rank it there. I would probably bump it up to about a 7 out of 10, but I realize this game won't be everyone's cup of tea.
Sengoku, for me, is a unique beat-em-up. It seems kind of strange compared to the other beat-em-ups that were around this time period. Think about, like, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Streets of Rage, which will come out a little bit later than this. To me, I think that makes it a bit more enjoyable that it is unique. So while I don't think this will have as much of a universal appeal as those other franchises, I really feel like this game is maybe not a hidden gem, but it was hidden to me.
Last, we're going to look at King of Monsters, and again, this game is another pass for me. I just really couldn't get into it, especially considering the number of very good, high-quality fighting games that we released on this platform before the system was done. It left me wanting a lot more than this game offers. Looking at the puzzle and platformer games, I thought I'd start with a puzzle game that is strangely called Puzzled. When looking at this game, maybe another famous puzzle game from the time period will be flashing across your mind, as I know it was for me. It does look a lot like Tetris, and the core gameplay is about the same. However, your goal in each level is actually to free the blimp, or whatever that is, at the bottom of the screen by clearing out all of the obstacles. And of course, like in Tetris, the only way to clear rows is to actually complete them out. Upon its release in Japan, this game was actually the top arcade game of 1990, outperforming other titles such as Carrier Air Wing and Raiden. However, I get the impression that here in the US, this game was not received as well. In my opinion, while this game is not as good as original classic Tetris in my mind, I found that the twist on the gameplay was actually kind of a unique concept, and I found myself playing this for a little bit. So if you do like Tetris and you don't mind seeing a twist in the gameplay, I would say give this one a try. You may be surprised that you like it. But if you don't like Tetris, I would say to avoid it. Blue's Journey is a side-scrolling platform game that was released by Alpha Denshi. In this game, your character, named Blue, has the ability to stun enemies, pick them up, and throw them as projectiles. The character can also shrink himself down in order to access hidden areas, and a second player can take control of an unnamed green palette swap of Blue. Overall, I did enjoy my initial playthrough of this game, and I think I've been back to it a couple times since. I feel like the game is designed really well, and it held my interest through the different levels that I played. Reviewers of the time and contemporary reviews are kind to this title, giving it mixed to a positive reception. I would give this around a 7 out of 10, and would definitely recommend it to anyone who wants an introduction to platformers on this system, mainly because there aren't that many, and this is a good one. The other platform game available at launch was also by Alpha Denshi, and that was Magician Lord. This game reminds me of other platformers like Ghouls and Ghosts and Rastan. Your goal is to guide the protagonist through 8 stages of varying themes, where the main objective is to recover the 8 mistable books that were stolen by the game's main antagonist. Overall, while I did enjoy this game, I will note that some people may be turned away from the platformer's insane high difficulty, and that's where the flashbacks to Ghouls and Ghosts came in for me.
So Magician Lord is one of those games that I really feel like was meant to eat quarters in the arcades. I found out if you just stand still for even a little bit, there's this monster that pops out of the corner and starts instantly attacking you. It's really meant to make you keep going, so that if somebody else needs to use the arcade machine and pump in more quarters, then you're out of the way, or you put in more quarters yourself. So that's something I found was a bit of a turnoff for me personally on this game, as opposed to other platformers where I'm sometimes able to take my time.
And as usual, I have the least to say about the sports games on the system. League Bowling is just that, it's bowling, and it's on the Neo Geo, so there's that.
Writing Hero to me is a special treat because this reminds me a lot of those raster effect arcade games that I used to play very early on in the arcades back in the day. And although it's a very dated style today, I don't think it lives up as much today. It's something that I personally found a bit nostalgic. However, I do miss the gimmicks that used to come along with those arcade racers, as some of those, like I'm specifically thinking of like Super Hang-On, had a cabinet where you had a motorcycle you could sit on, or a steering wheel at the very least. Playing this with a joystick on the Neo Geo AES is not ideal, but again a special treat for me. So I've seen a lot of negative feedback on Top Players Golf for the Neo Geo, and I do agree with some of those criticisms, but as a launch title and one of the early golf games, comparing it to the games that came out around the same time, I really feel like it's either typical or really not that bad, or at least as bad as they were saying. Now I do agree with the reviews that there's a better golf game available even for this system, but for now I would say it's not unplayable. So overall, what did I think of the launch lineup of the Neo Geo AES? I feel that even though not every game was a Grand Slam home run winner in my opinion, I think that this was close to, if not, a perfect launch lineup for this system. Think about the variety of games that is offered on this system. We have sports, shooters, beat-em-ups, platformers. They have almost every game genre that is going to appeal to their game base here. I think that is something that every system launch should aspire to have. Now that said, a lot of these games were just ports of arcade games, and sadly that's not going to change as we go forward because that was the advantage of this system, is they could just port the arcade game very easily to this home system. And what I mean by sadly on that is that they are designed for one-run playthrough experiences. There is a memory card to go with this, but I don't really find myself wanting to save too much other than my high scores. But to tell you the truth, most games that were released for the Sega Genesis in this same time period in 1989, 90, and 91, they were all designed the same way. Think about Sonic the Hedgehog. It is designed to be played through in one sitting. Another game that came out in 1990 in the US, about the year before this system came out, was Super Mario Bros. 3. There's no save option there either. But the only thing I think holds these games back, that even though they don't have that save feature, they're designed to be played through in one sitting, these are games that are meant to challenge you over and over and over again because they were designed to eat quarters in the arcades, and they were also designed so that you couldn't just beat through them in 30 minutes and then you'd be bored after you just paid $650 for the console and $200 to $300 for a game for it.
To give you an idea of just how many fighting games were released during the Neo Geo's life cycle, let's take a look at all of the officially licensed games that were released for the Neo Geo platforms. Out of the 158 officially licensed games, 118 of them were released on the Neo Geo Advanced Entertainment System. And out of those 118 games, I count 51 as fighting games. That's 43% of the entire AES library, and most of those are by SNK. And in fact, if we just look at one game fighting series by SNK on the AES, this one series has spurred 18, or if you count the Art of Fighting series, 21 games out of all of the fighting games. Adding in the Samurai Showdown and World Heroes fighting series, you can also see how there were several popular game franchises that got their start on the Neo Geo. All the other titles I'm just going to throw in and say these are all of the rest. I'm even including 3 Count Bout, which is a wrestling title, but is the only one of its kind, so it felt appropriate to add it to the fighting games. Taking a look at my personal collection, you can see that all of the major game franchises have at least one entry in my collection, and that's mainly because of their accessibility when collecting them. Titles for the Japanese AES are often cheaper than buying the ones that released in North America, and because of the plethora of fighting games that are out there, these titles were all also on the cheaper end to collect. But by cheaper to collect, I mean somewhere around or just under $100 each. Which is why in this review, I'm going to let my multi-game 161-in-1 cart and the Neo SD cart shoulder most of the work in this video.
And here's a moment I've been really excited for. That is, the moment we're going to take a look at the fighting games on the Neo Geo. Let's get started.
As I've already covered the King of Fighters series in its own review video, all I'm going to say in this video is that this ended up being my favorite of the big series on the Neo Geo. Which may not be as much of a surprise, as it seems like the best of all the SNK franchises ends up in this series. The Fatal Fury series was the direct inspiration for the King of Fighters, and I really did enjoy this series, except for I didn't enjoy it as much as some of the games in the King of Fighters. With one exception. Garou Mark of the Wolves ended up being, I think, my favorite fighter on the system. If not, it's pretty far up there. It's a really good game. But again, I've already covered this series in its own review video as well. What I like about the Samurai Showdown series, in contrast to Fatal Fury or the King of Fighters, is its unique setting. Keeping true to the time period of Japan's history that this game series takes place in, really made it stand out between the other fighting series. But overall, again, in terms of the big fighting game series, I would rank this third. One fighting series that I did not cover in its own review video was World Heroes. This game was released in 1992 and published by Alpha Denshi, later known as ADK, with the assistance of SNK. This game takes place in the distant future, where a well-renowned and famous scientist is determined to figure out who the strongest fighter in history is, and has gone to great lengths in order to finally gain the answer to this question. Through the use of a time machine that he has built, he has brought together the world's most powerful superheroes throughout each century so that all of them can compete in a one-on-one fighting deathmatch tournament. Much of the gameplay in World Heroes is controlled with 3 of the 4 buttons: A to punch, B to kick, and C to throw. There are 8 playable characters in the roster, and 2 different play modes to choose from: Normal Game and Deathmatch. In Normal Game, players have to defeat the other 7 playable characters in a random order, followed by a battle against the final boss. Deathmatch is just like Normal Mode, but with a twist. Players fight in a ring with environmental hazards such as electrical barriers, spiked walls, oil puddles, and more obstacles which players must avoid when they're fighting. Overall, this game received mixed to positive reviews in the arcades, but as expected for the time, home ports to other consoles were not up to the challenge. And as much as I enjoyed this title, I ended up enjoying the second title a bit more because it was the first title I ever put in to my Neo Geo AES. World Heroes 2 was released in 1993, and the plot of this game takes place a year from its predecessor. Because of the interference of the final boss from the first game, the evil scientist feels that he was not able to get an accurate answer to who is the world's best fighter, so he basically stages the tournament again. World Heroes 2 controls much like its predecessor, except there is now an ability used to throw when close enough to an opponent, or taunt against the opponent. The roster is expanded to 14 playable characters in all. In normal game mode, the player must defeat 4 of the original 8 characters introduced in the original World Heroes, again chosen at random, but after that the player must defeat 2 bosses in order to win the game. Deathmatch mode also makes a return, adding obstacles to the ring that you must avoid. This game was very well received in arcades of both Japan and North America, with scores averaging around 8.5 out of 10 to 9 out of 10. Upon its release, one reviewer said it was the best Neo Geo fighting game next to Fatal Fury 2, and is as good as Street Fighter 2. Now that is a bold statement. Given the choice between the two, I think I would still prefer Street Fighter, but this one definitely gives it a run for its money, and is an enjoyable experience on the console. The game was followed up in 1994 with the game World Heroes 2 Jet, which added 3 new characters, as well as new and modified moves, as well as fighting statistics added to the playable characters that return from the first 2 World Heroes. However, the normal game and deathmatch modes are replaced by Entry to the Tournament and the Forging of Warriors. In Entry to the Tournament, the objective is to first face 4 groups that have 3 opponents per group, and defeat at least 2 out of the 3 opponents in each group. Then the player must defeat Captain Kidd in at least 2 out of 3 rounds, and then lastly the player must defeat Hanzu the same way, as well as defeating Zeus's henchmen, before facing Zeus himself. In the Forging of Warriors, the player selects an opponent to fight against. Each battle against a character, like in most fighting games at the time of its release, requires the player to win 2 out of 3 rounds to completely win against each opponent. Once the player wins or loses, the player returns to the player select and enemy select screens. After winning against 4 opponents in a row, the game will end. This game again received average to positive reviews, with one reviewer praising the tournament mode and the new moves, but criticizing the absence of deathmatch and the slow-paced gameplay. I think that's what I personally didn't like about this one as compared to its predecessor, but this one was also a very competent title. The series wraps up in 1995 with the game World Heroes Perfect. In this game, each character has a traditional 4-button attack layout instead of the 2 out of the 3 pressure-sensing button attack layout like its predecessors had. Players are able to perform weak or strong versions of special moves depending on whether they press one or both punch or kick buttons with the special move command. New additions include a few new playable characters, and each character now has a special move that they can use by pressing the A, B, and C buttons simultaneously. All the game modes in the previous titles were excluded in this version, however, the main mode is similar to the normal game modes of World Heroes 1 and 2, as well as entry to the tournament mode that was present in 2 Jet. There are 16 playable characters, plus 3 unlockable ones using codes. The object of the game is to face off against several of the playable characters selected at random, and after defeating 10 characters, the player will then face off against Zeus and NEOGEO. If the player defeats NEOGEO, they will be able to see their selected character's ending. This game has been mixed with more of a mixed outlook than other titles in the series, with one reviewer from GamePro stating that it was almost perfect, but expressed disappointment that it was only an upgrade over the previous installment. Maybe it's because I played all of these games in order, but this one I thought was the weakest out of the series, with 2 still being my favorite.
World Heroes Perfect!
The Last Blade is a fighting game that was developed by SNK, released for the Neo Geo in 1997, and this game acts as a spiritual successor to the Samurai Showdown series, and that is due to it being a similar 2D weapons-based fighting game. The game has 2 selectable fighting styles. The 2 styles are Speed Mode and Power Mode. Speed Mode allows players to change several normal attacks into a special or a Super Desperation move. Power Mode, on the other hand, grants the player increased damage potential, and gives access to Super Desperation moves, which inflict an exorbitant amount of damage. The characters in the Last Blade series are mostly of Japanese origin, except for one who is from China and another who is from Russia. Some characters are based on historical or legendary figures. The game takes place between the 1850s and 1860s in Japan, and incorporates various elements of Japanese mythology, with a heavy emphasis on the symbology of the 4 symbols. Like in Samurai Showdown, the background music heavily incorporates synthesized instruments, simulating a sound appropriate to 19th century Japan. This game has received a positive reception since its release, with some giving it a 9 out of 10, and I've seen reviews go down to 8 out of 10. The game also spawned a sequel in 1998, with gameplay that remains about the same as its predecessor with some minor adjustments. This game does not have as strong reviews as its predecessor, but still holds its own at about 7 or 8 out of 10. But I did see that a lot of the reviews of the time note that it was too bad that you won't be able to play this game, as it would have to be imported. In 2012, Games Radar included Last Blade 2 among a list of little-known classic fighting games that deserve HD remakes, saying that this is one of the Neo Geo's prettiest and deepest fighters. In terms of my experience, I think this does compare very well to the Samurai Showdown series, so if you are a fan of that series, this would be a no-brainer that you should try to seek out these titles as well. As of the making of this video, you can still get a standalone digital copy of The Last Blade 2 on the PlayStation 4, but it's also among the cheaper titles to collect, and it also got a port on the Sega Dreamcast if you have that system, but again, it's also among the cheaper titles to collect for the Neo Geo if you want to get it for that system.
時間切れそこで眠ってな
I I previously covered King of the Monsters in the Launch Games video, but to follow up, there was a sequel made to that game in 1992, and it's surprising to me that this is by SNK, only due to the fact that I didn't enjoy either one of these games. I like the concept that you're basically fighting all of these monsters as they rage a war against the globe, but I don't think it was executed very well. At least I didn't find this very fun to play at all. And for a system that's known for groundbreaking fighting games, I think this one's a pass. Breakers is a competitive fighting game that was developed by Visco and was released for the Neo Geo in 1996. And this game kind of reminds me of Fatal Fury. That is, in terms of its gameplay. I think it's obvious that most of the characters take inspiration from the game Street Fighter II. This game did not receive good reviews at the time of its release, getting about a 5 out of 10 from the game reviews that I've seen, but the game has gained something of a cult following. The home ports of Breakers was never released outside of Japan, pushing it deeply into obscurity. This game became more accessible with the use of emulators, because this game was never released outside of Japan, and there were no home ports of its sequel, Breaker's Revenge. My opinion of this game is a typical fighting game of the era, and nothing really stood out to me about it. So again, not something I would consider essential for your Neo Geo experience, but if you want to see some of those fighters that nobody's ever played before, this would be one to start with. And speaking of obscure titles on the Neo Geo, this is Matra Melee. This was an arcade fighting game published by Playmore in March of 2003. As it was one of the last games released on the system, it is up there in collector's value. But is it worth it to actually play? Well, to start with, this is actually the 5th installment of the Power Instinct series, making it a sequel to Rage of the Dragons. This game brings back the roster from Power Instinct 2, except for a few characters who are omitted, plus 4 totally new characters and 1 new boss. It also features 4 unlockable characters from Rage of the Dragons. In the game's story, the king of a certain country wants to find a worthy successor for the throne and the ideal husband for his daughter. So I guess the only solution to that problem is to hold a fighting tournament where the prize is the hand of the princess and the throne. This game's visual style and gameplay were something that I found unique to make it stand out against the plethora of fighting titles that are on this system. And as a result, I would say if you can get access to this title by any means, I would say give it a shot. Rage of the Dragons, which came out the year before, features a tag team system in which the player takes control of 2 characters and can switch between one or the other during gameplay. And I enjoyed this game as well, but I did find the experience to be different from Matra Melee. To describe it, I would quote a review I read that said it's an excellent game for anyone that is into the late 2D era of fighters, and I think you will enjoy the rad character designs and awesome soundtrack. I've seen this game also mentioned as one of the best SNK fighting games ever made, and while I wouldn't put it that high, I would definitely say it is worth a try, again, if you're a fan of 2D fighting games. SNK vs. Capcom SVC Chaos was released in 2003 for the Neo Geo arcade and home platforms, and the gameplay in this game is similar to the King of Fighters 2002. It kind of has the same 4-button configuration and many of the same techniques. However, the game does not follow the team battle format. But basically, it's like if King of Fighters turned into a game where you fought against different universes, SNK versus Capcom. And if you're a fan of both SNK fighter games and Capcom fighter games, you may not be disappointed with this title, but for me, I actually found it a bit underwhelming. The only difference between this and a lot of the other fighting games is just the characters you get to choose from. Overall, a unique crossover, but not one that really stood out in my opinion.
その程度なの
No escape!
Savage Rain.
Savage Rain is a futuristic-themed competitive fighting game that was released in 1995 by SNK, and although Savage Rain is set in the first half of the 21st century in the fictional city of Southtown, which was the same city used in Fatal Fury and the Art of Fighting series, it actually in gameplay plays a bit more like Samurai Showdown because it is a weapons fighter. But in this game, weapons can be thrown at an opponent from a distance for more ranged attacks. There are also 2 levels of playing fields, where you can jump between the 2 of them to either avoid or launch attacks from. The button layout for attacks resembles World Heroes a little bit, with a button for punching, one for kicking, and another one for the weapon, as well as jumping between the 2 different planes. And much like the Art of Fighting, the camera can zoom in on the characters when they are in close proximity, and the 2-plane system reminds me a lot of Fatal Fury. Despite being a lot like other games in the series, it's kinda like a nice matchup of the best of each of those game franchises. I did personally enjoy this game for that reason, but I see the reviews of this game are a bit all over the place, with a lot of them ranging between 4 out of 10 to 8 out of 10. But I think that range can barely be defined with one comment. If you can't get enough of these kind of fighting games, here's another. I like the game, but I wouldn't consider it essential over the series that inspired it, so this game may be more suited to those that are really hardcore fans of the 2D fighting game genre. The game did spawn a sequel in 1996 called Kaizuna Encounter, and this game has been compared more to Real Bout Fatal Fury's fighting system. I have a similar opinion of this game, but I think I liked Savage Rain just a little bit better. Waku Waku 7 was released in 1996 and was developed by Sunsoft. This game was met with generally positive reception from critics since its initial release, with one reviewer praising the audio design, unique fighting system, and character roster, but criticized its implementation of the power gauge mechanic. I have seen several people note that this is an underrated and virtually unknown fighting game, but I've seen it listed as one of the best that was published by SNK. I think what made this game stand out for me was the art style and character design. It almost appears more cartoony than all of the rest of the games on this platform, and I think it made it stand out in my memory because of it. Otherwise, there's not really much more I can say about this game that I haven't said about all the other games. It just lives up to that typical, average to above average gameplay that you expect from some of these fighting games.
So what are my thoughts on the fighting games of the Neo Geo? I have to tell you, if you are a huge fan of fighting games, there are a lot of must-haves for your collection. The only thing that holds me back from recommending this system to everyone is its price. And fortunately, some of these fighting games are so popular that you can find them for a cheaper price. So you shouldn't have trouble finding at least 1 or 2 titles for your collection, but you'll have to decide for yourself which titles you want to collect, because they all are going to be expensive, because that's just the nature of collecting for the Neo Geo. And I should note that I am not the biggest fan of fighting games, at least when you're playing against the computer, and I was taken back and surprised at how many of these games I did thoroughly enjoy. It did take me back to that time in the mid-90s when 2D fighting games were all the rage. And even though they don't include some of the iconic series that I grew up with, like Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat, these games are worthy competitors, and I would definitely recommend that if you have a Neo Geo, you've got to pick some of these up. It is just a requirement.
As opposed to traditional versus fighting games, beat-em-ups traditionally put the player against multiple enemies at once, while traversing through different stages and levels, usually to accomplish some goal explained through the game's plot. So let's go ahead and take a look at the games offered in this game genre on the Neo Geo. Burning Fight is a beat-em-up arcade game released by SNK in 1991, originally for the Neo Geo MVS and making its way to the AES around the same time. It would also see a release on the Neo Geo CD in 1994. This title was introduced to capture a share of the then popular beat-em-ups market. The game was specifically designed to compete with the game Double Dragon, which was the leader in the genre at the time. The game was produced by Akechi Kawasaki, who was one of SNK's founders, and he was also the man behind various well-known SNK titles such as Fatal Fury and Samurai Showdown. The story of this game introduces us to two popular and renowned New York City police detectives, Duke and Billy. While investigating a dangerous Japanese crime syndicate, they are led to the mean streets of Japan where they meet a police officer and martial arts expert named Ryu. Ryu agrees to join the NYPD detectives as they track down the crime syndicate boss and end their reign of terror once and for all. And how do you do that? Well, you simply walk down the street and anyone who walks up to you, you punch them in the face until they are dead. Burning Fight follows a formula and concepts formerly seen in other titles of this genre, such as Streets of Rage, Double Dragon, and Final Fight. You are given the choice to play as any one of the three characters, each with their own unique stats, as well as advantages or disadvantages to playing through the game. Objects and weapons can be found on the ground that can cause greater damage to your opponents, and as you walk around the playfield, you can interact with some of the objects in the environment. For example, you can damage objects like phone booths and street signs along the way, but for the most part your character remains at the same ability level throughout. And overall, while playing this game, I found myself completely underwhelmed. I didn't feel like the game was poorly designed, but I did get tired of it very quickly. And I think that comes down to the fact that this was meant to compete with other fighting games at the time, and you can tell that was the sole purpose. This was a game that was meant to be enjoyed for a few minutes in the arcade, having the potential to drain your quarter cup, but as a home console experience, it becomes very repetitive and tedious very quickly. When this game was released, it did receive generally mixed receptions from critics, noting that the game really didn't have anything to offer other than just another side-scrolling beat-em-up experience. More recent reviews of this game have been less kind, giving it around a 3 out of 10, again voicing those concerns but adding that the playstyle is very dated. I do think a 2-player run-through would be a lot more entertaining than the single-player campaign, and while I don't feel like this is a bad game by any means, I would say don't go out of your way to find this title.
Runs as fast as lightning, the 8 super robots beat all evils.
8-Man was developed by Palace and published by SNK internationally, and it was released in 1991 for the Neo Geo MVS, and it came out for the AES that November. It is based on Kazumasa Hirai's 1963 manga and anime superhero of the same name. 8-Man is considered one of the earliest cyborg superhero characters from Japan. In this game, you take control of 8-Man, and player 2 can take control of his comrade, 9-Man, to fight against an evil invading robot army. The game takes place across 10 stages in a futuristic setting where a biocomputer system called Cyber is threatening mankind with his evil army of robots. And how do you defeat them? By walking down the street and punching anything that moves until it dies. As expected in a side-scrolling beat-em-up, the players can only move left or right on the screen, and this game uses a 3-button control scheme, using A for attack, B for jump, and C for a special attack. Also, if you hold the B button while pressing down on the joystick, the character will perform a slide movement. The levels are broken into different phases. Some of them involves the players chasing a vehicle, while enemies come out to attack. Power-ups are scattered along the way that can be collected that will enhance the player's attack, as well as grant screen-clearing bombs that damage all enemies in sight. After reaching the end of a level, a boss must be fought in order to get to the next stage. If a memory card is present, the player is allowed to save their progress and resume into the last stage that the player saved at. 8-Man ended up being more popular than Burning Fight, and I think I enjoyed this game better as well. And I think I attribute that most to this game's art direction and tight controlled gameplay. I've seen this game rated at a 7 or 8 out of 10, with more modern reviews giving it about a 6 out of 10, but I would say a 7 out of 10 seems about right to me. However, potentially due to the fact that this is a licensed media product, I have not seen any other ports of this game except for on the Neo Geo. If you know of any, please leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, you will have to play this on your Neo Geo or through emulation to be able to experience it. Mutation Nation came out in 1992 for the Neo Geo. It came out to the AES that same year and eventually in 1995 for the Neo Geo CD. The game takes place in that iconic year of 20XX, where a mad scientist was shut down by his superiors after conducting bizarre biological experiments. Several years after the mad scientist's lab exploded and the scientist himself mysteriously disappeared, a genetic virus has started to spread among the tenants of the Forgotten Slums where the experiments took place. Two men, Ricky Jones and Johnny Hart, return to town after being away for a long time, and when they see what's happened, they take it upon themselves to clean up the town before the mutants spread across the country. Taking control of either Ricky or Johnny, you fight your way through 6 levels of various mutated and mechanical enemies. Each level contains one or more mini-boss before fighting the actual main boss at the end of each stage. The game uses a standard control scheme for allowing the player to beat up on enemies, use special moves, and jump, but rather than picking up objects to throw at enemies, this game allows the player to pick up one of 4 elemental spheres that allow the player the ability to unleash screen-filling super attacks. There are also neutral spheres that will allow the player to recover some of their life, as well as increase the number of super attacks they can use. The spheres have a letter that represent what each one is, and a different color so the player can tell them apart. The yellow sphere with the letter A is light, red with the letter B is fire, blue with the letter C is lightning, and green with the letter D is wind. This game was well received by players and critics alike upon its release, with game reviews being around 8 or 9 out of 10. And out of the games I've played so far on the beat-em-up genre, I would say this one is an improvement over the previous 2. The topic and subject matter of this game give it a unique style which I think separates it from the other games so far, and there is something to be said about the grossness of the mutation and death animations. This game has been re-released on the Switch and the PlayStation Store, so if you wanted to pick this game up, you don't have to have it on original hardware, and again, I would highly recommend 2-player mode. Robo Army was also developed and published by SNK and released in 1991 for the Neo Geo arcade and home console, and it also got a release in 1995 on the Neo Geo CD. When you start playing, you'll notice there is no character selection in Robo Army. Player 1 controls Maxima, and Player 2 controls Rocky. Both are cyborgs that must cross 6 levels before reaching the final boss. The player will fight with their fists and their feet, but they can also defend themselves by collecting improvised weapons, such as cars, barrels, and even a destroyed robot arm. Throughout the game, you can also be transformed for a brief moment into an invulnerable armored vehicle. And you may ask yourself, why are you fighting in this game, and who are you fighting against? Well, you're fighting to free your creator, who was kidnapped, along with his daughter, as well as bring those responsible to justice. This game did prove popular upon release, and at the time received very good reviews from critics and gamers, but I've seen them range between 9 out of 10 to 7 out of 10, with the more modern reviews leaning towards the 7. And I think that's where my opinion of this game would also land, as about a 7 out of 10. Average, nothing game-breaking, and something that wasn't a complete waste of my time. Again, this was also ported to the Nintendo Switch if you wanted to get it for that system, but as I go through these games I do realize that I'm probably speaking to people who are more or less hardcore fans of this genre. The first Sengoku was a launch title for the Neo Geo, and SNK would follow that up in 1993 with Sengoku 2. This game also made an appearance in 1995 for the Neo Geo CD. In this game, an evil warlord is intent on conquering the world, and he uses time travel to conquer every known important event in history. The two characters from the previous game are sent by a priestess from the past to battle the warlord's forces and restore the world's ages to ensure the failure of the warlord's conquest. In terms of gameplay, it is very similar to the first Sengoku, except that now, the player character is constantly armed with a sword, which they can use to initiate wide plane attacks and vertical slashes. By pressing both of the attack buttons together, it will allow the player to block or dodge attacks. Special moves are also available using the correct button combo, and the player has the ability to jump and perform jump attacks. The player can transform into 3 different forms, including a wolf, ninja, and Tengu warrior, each having their own abilities, and they only last for a limited time. Along your journey, you can collect various orbs to heal your character, or enhance the character's attack abilities, as well as your attacks while you're in a different form. As with the first Sengoku, I was taken in with this game's style. It definitely has more of a Japanese style than I think I'm used to seeing with these games, and its visuals and lore is something that helps keep me engaged and interested into this game. I have seen review scores of this game all over the place between 7 and 8 out of 10, but out of all the other games, I would say this is closer to an 8 out of 10 with me. As with many Neo Geo titles, this game is up there in its collector's value, so acquiring a more modern port may be worth it to play this title. But out of all the ones I've played so far, I would recommend this one the most. Sengoku 3 was made in 2001 and was developed by Noise Factory, but published by SNK, making it the third and final entry in the Sengoku series. This game does follow that traditional side-scrolling beat-em-up format of the original 2 games, and when starting out you take control of one of the 4 initial playable characters, with the ability to unlock 2 more throughout your gameplay. One thing I found unique about this game is its soundtrack. It doesn't sound like any other soundtrack I've heard on the Neo Geo, at least on this game genre. In fact, it almost sounds like they're using nothing but samples and not using any synthesis from the sound chip. Just listen to this example. Upon doing some further research, I found out that Toshikazu Tanaka, who had worked on previous SNK soundtracks, such as Fatal Fury King of Fighters, decided on using streaming playback for the music. As the Neo Geo sound hardware was not designed for music streaming, such as what you would get from an audio CD or an MP3 file, it would be quite a challenge for him to get the soundtrack to sound at high enough quality for the game. When it was released, Sengoku 3 received very positive reception from critics, and is the highest rated of the Sengoku trilogy. If you are hoping to collect this title for your Neo Geo AES, Sadly, this is one of those games that would require you to save up a bunch of money, or already have a lot to begin with, as I have seen this title listed for more than $2,000. Perhaps what would make this game more accessible is one of its more modern ports on a more modern system. Overall, I did enjoy this title as well. I would probably rank it about even with Sengoku 2, but some people prefer this one over the rest. Overall, I would say the Sengoku series is the best of the beat-em-ups on the system, and you can't really go wrong with any one of them. And lastly, that leads me to a Japanese exclusive fighting game, which was Legend of Success Joe, being released for the Neo Geo in 1991. This is a boxing game that was developed by Wave Corporation, and this game is actually based on Ashita no Joe, a manga that was created by Tetsuya Chiba and Asao Takamori. This game is noteworthy for being the first third-party game developed for the Neo Geo. And while not being released outside of Japan, a complete English translation can be seen when played on non-Japanese systems. The player takes on the title character, Joe Yabuki, an aspiring boxer, as he goes from an unknown kid from the rough side of town to a boxing champion. This game actually follows more of a traditional beat-em-up format, with some parts of the game taking place outside of the boxing ring, where Joe has to fight off bullies in back alleyways as he trains. The controls of this game are a bit complicated at first, but after watching the tutorial, I was able to get the hang of this through a couple of playthroughs. And to be honest, while I've seen the reception of this game being very mixed, having review scores between 4 or 6 out of 10, I actually enjoyed this one. This game does have its quirks, and I'm not saying it's perfect. I did find the controls, again, like I said, confusing at first, and sometimes I felt like I was putting in the correct combinations, but my player was just doing whatever he wanted to do. But I think my biggest critique of this game is that it looks like it could have been done on any other contemporary home system. The music in this game kept giving me Sega Genesis vibes. And no, not in a good way. It has that kind of generic, tinny sound that you would hear from an early Sega Genesis game. The game's graphics and animations look like they could have been done on any other platform, with the characters looking like they have stiff, choppy movements, when I know there are other titles on this system that were able to provide a more smooth experience. So overall, I would give this game about a 6 out of 10, which is higher among the reviews that I've seen for this game, as I've seen a lot of reviews call this one of the worst on the Neo Geo. But if you have access to this game, I would definitely give it a try. You may be surprised by it. I've already covered the Metal Slug series in its own review video, as I really do feel like that is the premier franchise on this console in terms of run-and-gun shooter games. Out of all of the games that I played in this series, I really didn't find a bad one in the bunch. The graphics and sound and art direction of this game really do stand out, and I think they're just very well-made games that have stood the test of time better than some of the other games released during this time period. Looking back on it, I think my only criticism was that if I played them all in a row, I did get a little bit of franchise fatigue. The only tragedy about this series is that it is incredibly expensive to collect for the Neo Geo. Thankfully, it has been re-released several times, and I would definitely recommend picking this up on any modern console as a digital title, but I am also happy to have a physical copy for my PlayStation 2 and PSP. If you want to see more about each of the individual games, I recommend going back and watching my Metal Slug review series, as I dive into them in great detail.
Ninja Commando!
Ninja Commando is a vertically scrolling run-and-gun shooter video game developed by Alpha Denshi and published by SNK. It was first released for the Neo Geo in 1992, and it was released for the Neo Geo CD in 1994. In this game, you choose between one of 3 ninja characters that are all part of an elite group of Ninja Commandos. Each character has a different background and differing abilities. Your goal in this game is to stop the main villain and his Mars Corporation from using a time machine to destroy the past and control the future. This will have you fighting in several different locations around the world during different time periods. In terms of gameplay, I kept getting vibes from games like Akari Warriors, as you are constantly battling from this top-down perspective. And as usual, you just fight your way through the entire level until you reach a boss at the end of the stage. Do that enough times and you have beaten the game. When this game was released, I've seen it get review scores between 7 and 9 out of 10, with my overall experience being around a 6 or a 7 out of 10. I enjoyed the tight controlled gameplay as well as the visuals and the music, but overall to me something just felt kind of generic about this game. So for me there's nothing remarkable about this title, but if you're a fan of the genre, I think you'll find this title at least a little entertaining. Shock Troopers is another run-and-gun arcade game, this time developed by Saurus and published by SNK in 1997. In this game, you take control of one of 3 soldiers on a mission to save a scientist and his granddaughter, who are kidnapped in order for an evil organization to gain control over a powerful drug that turns people into superhuman soldiers. You get to choose at the beginning of the game whether you're going to attempt the game as a lone wolf or in team battle. In Lonely Wolf, one character is controlled throughout the entire game, while in team battle you're allowed to select from a band of 3 soldiers throughout the missions, being able to switch between them on the fly. Each character has their own stats. For example, some might start with a higher life bar, while others can move faster. One thing I like about this game is that you're able to shoot in all 8 different directions, which is a blessing in this game because danger is usually coming in all directions. Something key to your playthrough as well is that if you hold down the fire button while moving, you will continue firing in that direction and begin strafing. I'm sure this was mentioned in how to play the game, but I actually discovered this by accident while I was playing, and that became a game saver. Again, nothing really changes. You have to go through each level, fighting a boss at the end, for a total of 7 levels. And in terms of game reviews, I've seen this score quite well, with critics being around an 8 or a 9 out of 10, and with my initial playthrough, I would rank it at about an 8 out of 10. I found this title a bit more fun than Ninja Commandos, and I found this one a bit hard to put down, especially being a fan of run-and-gun shooters from the arcades of this time period.
We must stop these crimes scene. They have only 72 hours to accomplish their objectives. The 4 specialists will exterminate the troops of DAC. They will never be defeated. Shock Troopers, Second Squad.
A sequel was released in 1998 for the Neo Geo. However, despite being made by the same development company, it is listed as having no connection with the first Shock Troopers game. The gameplay system has been changed drastically, as there are only 4 players that are selectable, and there is no team mode available as from the first Shock Troopers. This game relies more heavily on pre-rendered sprites, and you're allowed to hop in some vehicles throughout the game, reminding me a little bit of Metal Slug. This game was not as well reviewed as the original, but I think that is solely due to the fact that this is a sequel to Shock Troopers, but it doesn't really feel like it. I agree with the reviews that mention if you judge this game as being a standalone title, it is definitely excellent and holds its own weight, but when comparing it to the other title, this one just comes up a bit short. I would still give it a rating of about 8 out of 10, definitely something that I enjoyed, and I think a lot of people would find enjoyment out of this game as well. Sonic Wings 2, which was released overseas as Aero Fighters 2, is a vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up arcade game released in 1994 by Video System and published by SNK. It would be released for the Neo Geo CD that same year. In this game, you get to jump into the cockpit of an aircraft that is determined by which character you choose and country on the selection screen. You fight through each vertically scrolling level, playing with 2 buttons. The A button fires projectiles from the plane, and the B button launches your special bomb attack from a limited stock of bombs. You can upgrade your weapons by collecting power-ups along the way. When certain ground enemies or buildings are destroyed, money bonuses will appear, which give a set number of points based on how fast you destroy them and how quickly you collect the bonus. In my experience, though, these are usually a trap, so I would recommend ignoring them unless you're really trying to bump up your high score. When you reach the end of a stage, you have to face off against a boss ship. Do this about 10 times, and you will beat the game. Once you beat the game, depending on the character you select, there is a different ending. Then, in true arcade fashion, the game just starts over again, this time with swapping out the color palette, but if you beat the game this time, the game will truly end. This game has been met with positive reception from reviewers and critics since its release, and even in modern reviews, and I would say that I enjoyed it as well. I didn't really find it too remarkable, but I give it about an 8 out of 10. If you like that game, you will probably like Aero Fighters 3, which was released the following year in 1995, still developed by Video System. Strangely, the home port of the AES version did not make it overseas, but the MVS and Neo Geo CD versions did. This game expands the total stage count to 18, of which 8 will be played in each of the game's 2 loops using a branching system, allowing you to choose your own path. Upon its release, this game was met with more mixed reception from critics. Some reviewers praised the intense action and the audio soundtrack, but some said that the gameplay was not as fresh and definitely not as fun as Aero Fighters 2. And although I'm thinking around those same lines, I would definitely say this game is a 7 out of 10. It plays well, it kind of feels like more of the same from Aero Fighters 2 in my opinion, so if you like that game, you'll like this one even more, but if you're going to play just one, I would start out with the second one. Androdunos is a scrolling shooter video game that was developed by Visco Corporation and published by SNK in 1992. The game takes place in a futuristic sci-fi setting where an unknown alien race from outer space, as opposed to alien races not from outer space, have begun an invasion. You, as the player, take control of a space fighter craft in a last-ditch effort for mankind to overthrow the alien forces. A notable feature of this game is the ability to choose between 4 different weapon sets at any time in a linear order by pressing the B button. Each weapon can be powered up multiple times from their original state, and you can hold down the fire button to charge up your weapon for a very powerful shot against the enemies. However, doing so will downgrade your weapon to the previous power level. Taking a hit will cause your craft to be destroyed, and when you respawn, your weapons also will be downgraded 1 level. Since its release, this game has received more of a mixed reception than its contemporaries, but from my experience, this is a game that I was told by several people before starting this review that I had to include in the Ultimate Neo Geo review. I did enjoy this game, but really felt like it was more of a 7 out of 10 kind of title. Again, it's very competently made, nothing game-breaking, but there's nothing remarkable to make it an excellent experience for me. Polestar is a 1995 horizontal scrolling shooter video game that was published by SNK but developed by ACOM. In this game, players control a starship in its mission to eradicate the solar system of a hostile race of aliens that threaten mankind. And immediately into jumping into the game, you may get some serious R-Type vibes, and that was something that I definitely saw when I first played through this as well. But what makes this game stand out the most to me are the unique pre-rendered visuals. This was around the time that pre-rendered visuals were becoming very popular with game developers as a trick to make their systems look like they were doing better things than they were really capable of. And unlike other games that use pre-rendered visuals, these hold up quite well in my opinion. Combine that with a soundtrack that sounds almost unlike anything else on the Neo Geo, using more samples than synthesis, and I think that makes this game really stand out. So even though this game looks and sounds great, how does it play? Well, as I said before, it definitely gives me some strong R-Type vibes, and I'm a huge fan of that series. There are 8 stages that you automatically scroll through, and at the end of the stage, after you've defeated all the enemies, you face off against a boss. Throughout the levels, you're able to acquire an auxiliary drone, similar to what you would see in R-Type, allowing you to use it as a battering ram against smaller enemies, and using it as a shield against projectiles. You collect power-ups which upgrade your weapon, and of course using an auxiliary drone allows you to have special fire-powered attacks. This game received a mixed to positive reception from critics when it was released, but most of the positive reviews of this game really mention the fact that SNK was finally starting to branch out of versus fighter games. The pre-rendered graphics and sound were also mentioned as 2 of the top game's selling points, but when it came down to gameplay, many felt that it was unimpressive. Some mentioned that during some parts of the game, the enemies and projectiles blended too easily into the background, and others mentioned that it was at a much slower pace than they were expecting for a game of this caliber. Overall, I consider this game to be a very admirable attempt to create a game that was among the high-caliber standards that R-Type was setting in the market. But I think if I describe this game in one word, it would be the word almost. The game is almost great. It's hard to explain unless you are actually playing the game, but when you start playing it, you're very quickly realizing that there's just something missing out of the gameplay element that's keeping it from being a standout, excellent title. As such, I would give it around an 8 out of 10, but thankfully they released a sequel. Blazing Star is the sequel to Polestar, and it was developed by the same team, but they had changed their name from ACOM to Yamkobo. The game features gameplay that is very similar to its predecessor, with a story that revolves somewhat around cyborgs and artificial intelligence. Pretty sure you can fill in the blanks from there. And in my opinion, this is the game they got right. I really feel like this game is just a very polished version of Polestar. The graphics look a little bit more polished, the gameplay is better, and I didn't really feel like the arcade unfair difficulty was as strong with this one. In terms of other people's reviews though, some people feel that Polestar is the better one, and some people feel that Blazing Star is the better one. Review scores of this were kind of all over the map back in the day, usually giving around an 8 or 9 out of 10, but with most of the reviews being critical of the fact that by the time this game was released, the shoot-'em-up genre was on its way out. If you had to choose just one of these, I would say Blazing Star is my recommendation, but both of them I think provide a good time for a little bit different reason. Going back to the earlier shoot-'em-ups on the console, Last Resort is an arcade shoot-'em-up game that was released by SNK in 1992. And this game is perhaps the earliest example of SNK trying to copy the R-Type formula. And as such, the gameplay is just about the same as the other games I've mentioned. There are 5 stages that you will loop through twice to get through the end of the game, and along the way you're able to acquire an auxiliary drone that does all the same things you would expect it to do as you defeat the enemies in each stage and each stage's boss. Since its release, the game received around 8 or 9 out of 10 from reviewers, with them praising the gameplay and the graphics style, but criticizing the game's short length. I personally prefer the Polestar and Blazing Star series myself, but this one was also a very competent attempt. I would give it around an 8 out of 10. Another game that was very highly recommended that I include in this review was Twinkle Star Sprites. Unlike other scrolling shooter video games, this one provides a twist by making it a competitive game. Whereas you go through stages, the amount of enemies you defeat will determine obstacles sent to your opponents, and vice versa. And out of all the games I've mentioned in the scrolling shooter genre, I think this one stands out as being the most unique, mainly due to that gameplay style. And unlike other scrolling shooters, I would say this one is a must to play 2-player, as I think it provided endless amounts of fun. Playing this game in single player is definitely not as fun, kinda like playing Puyo Puyo as one player. This is the first time I've ever played a competitive shooter fighting game like this, and I have to say I was very well hooked on it for quite a while. And although I'd give it about a 7 out of 10, I definitely feel like it's one that everyone should experience, especially if they're fans of the shooting genre. And then that brings me to Viewpoint, which is an isometric scrolling shooter video game developed by ACOM and originally released in 1992 by Sammy and SNK for the Neo Geo. To describe how this game plays, I would say it's definitely inspired by Sega's Zaxxon, but also taking inspiration from games like Xevious and R-Type. From this standpoint, the game is definitely unique, but it offers a style of gameplay I think is much more dated than the other scrolling shooters. As with many scrolling shooters, you would expect that a lot of it is memorization of where enemies are going to spawn and where things are at, but that is turned up to an extreme I think in this game that really kept me from enjoying it to its full potential. Other reviews of this game have been a lot more kind, giving it close to a 10 out of 10 score when it first released, but mellowing out to around a 7.5 out of 10 in more recent reviews. And for me, it comes down to a personal preference of I don't really care for the isometric perspective, and that really kept me from enjoying this game as much as other people might. So even though I'd recommend this game as something unique to try, especially if you're tired of just the vertically or horizontally scrolling shooter games, I would give it around a 5 out of 10. The rest of these games are sadly only available on the NVS. However, using a proper converter, you can play these on your AES as well. Taking a look at Captain Tamade, I think the most unique thing about this game is just how you play it, as you're playing basically as a tomato that's going through with your fists and punching different enemies. Definitely a unique title that I would probably try out in an arcade, but didn't really offer me much more than a quick playthrough experience just to see what it was like. Prehistoric Isle 2 was co-developed by Soros and Yumkobo, both of which I have mentioned previously with other games in this review. In this game, you basically control helicopters to take down dinosaurs, and it's kind of a standard shoot-'em-up fare, but nothing really stands out about this one. Strikers 1945 Plus immediately caught my attention with that opening FMV cutscene, but overall disappointed when it came to the gameplay. It's really just as generic as could possibly be with a scrolling shooter. It can be fun, but overall I did feel it to be very generic. Z-Blade is another one that didn't really stand out to me as anything other than, like I said, a generic scrolling shooter. They didn't really screw it up, but again, nothing that stood out to me to make it worth recommending to anyone over any of the other games on this list. Overall, my thoughts on the run and gun and scrolling shooter video games that are on the Neo Geo are very positive. But I will add that this is a purely nostalgic point of view. I remember playing games mostly like what was on the Neo Geo, mainly in arcades, and almost always being disappointed at their home ports. Seeing them on the actual arcade hardware they were designed to run for in the 1990s, is a huge special treat that I am definitely glad to relive on this system. Most of these games are very fast and have a lot of moving objects on screen at once, and the Neo Geo powers through it like a champ. There were a few instances where I noticed that the game slowed down a lot, but I noticed that in titles where it really seemed like they were trying to get more out of the Neo Geo than it was capable of. But if I remember correctly, that was only from a couple games in the later parts of the 1990s, where the Neo Geo was trying to punch above its weight class by staying relevant in an era that would be quickly dominated by 3D-based games. Personal favorites that I've mentioned in this video have been Blazing Star and Polestar, Twinkle Star Sprites. One of the launch titles, Ghost Pilots, was one of my first games I plugged into the Neo Geo and provided a very good experience. But above all else, Metal Slug still stands at the top of this genre, being my favorite of the shooting games on the system. And even though I played through this series several times, it really doesn't seem to get old for me. It's just a game that I can easily jump back into, play through a couple levels, relive the nostalgia, and I can come back to it again in a couple weeks and be just as thrilled with it. Shock Troopers and Ninja Commando were also two games that I was unexpectedly surprised by. I did notice it was either Shock Troopers or Shock Troopers 2 that had the slowdown issue I had mentioned before, but it didn't really bog down the gameplay. It was still fun to play despite the slowdown. The biggest warning I have for those of you that may not be fans of the scrolling shooter video game genre is that these are all designed to be first and foremost arcade games. And that means in each game, somewhere along the line, you're going to encounter an enemy or a boss that was designed to drain your quarters. And this results in a lot of what seems like unfair deaths, but of course on multiple playthroughs you get to master it and you're able to eventually overcome it. And in fact, I think that's really the only criticism I have of any of these games, is that they are designed to be shorter arcade game playthroughs. I don't think there's any game on this list that would take you a very long time to complete, definitely nothing close to what modern games can accomplish. But it all comes back down to the core gameplay just being solid and addicting that I think makes these titles enjoyable despite the short length. We're going to have a mix and match of games including platformers, puzzle games, an RPG, and a few special bonus games. Let's go ahead and dive right in. Spin Master is an arcade game that was developed and released by Data East in December of 1993 in North America. It came out in Europe the same year, but released in Japan the following February in 1994. In this game, you're on a quest to save your girlfriend, but also on a quest to stop an evil mad doctor who wants to buy up all the world's toys and candy, plunging the children of Earth into bitter darkness and well-balanced meals. No joke, that's actually what the manual says. You can team up with a second player who will take control of Tom, and you will both be armed with your trusty yo-yo. And I think this game is just indicative of how much of a resurgence yo-yos had in the mid-90s. You use them to hit enemies and treasure chests that can contain better weapons like throwing stars, icicle daggers, and even guided missiles. Upon its release, this game received a fairly decent reception, with gamers and critics being enthralled with the unique platformer, as the arcade was not often a place where you would find action platform games. Nevertheless, this game has received around a 7 or 8 out of 10, with more recent reviews cooling off to around a 6 out of 10. But overall, I actually had a lot of fun with this one. My only main criticism is that yes, because this was designed to be an arcade game, there are areas that were designed to take your quarters, and thus result in a lot of what I consider cheap deaths. But I didn't think it detracted from the gameplay too much. I would give this one a play if you can. Thankfully it's been re-released over the years, so you can find it cheaper than on the Neo Geo.
Oh!
You are finished,
Top Hunter, Roddy and Cathy is a side-scrolling arcade platform game that was developed by SNK for the Neo Geo and was released in 1994. In addition to the MVS and AES release, it was also released on the Neo Geo CD. In this game, you play as the galaxy's top bounty hunters that are sent to put a stop to a colony of galactic pirates who threaten and plunder the cosmos. Player 1 takes control of Roddy, and Player 2 takes control of Cathy, and you must navigate through the stages collecting items, killing enemies, and killing a boss at the end of each area. You also get a set of special moves which can be performed by moving the joystick in certain directions and pressing the attack button. The game is split into 4 planets, which you get to choose from when you first start playing, and depending on which planet you pick first, the stage layout will change. After completing all 4 planets, the player is taken to the final stage, where they must rematch with the 4 bosses of the game, and then move on to the game's final antagonist, Captain Clapton. This game received mixed to positive reception when it was released, with Electronic Gaming Monthly giving it an average of around 7 out of 10, with some of the reviewers criticizing that the difficulty, even on the hardest setting, was way too easy, leaving them to conclude that there just wasn't enough value there for the price of a Neo Geo cartridge. However, paradoxically, every single one of the reviewers said they enjoyed the game. And I would say the same myself. I really did enjoy the game, although if you were to collect it for the Neo Geo, the price again may not justify buying it for the Neo Geo. But I had a fun time with it, and I would definitely recommend giving it a playthrough if you can find it. Next up is Bang Bang Busters, though the game's title screen lists it as Bang Squared Busters. And this game is unique because it was developed in 1994, but never released for unknown reasons until 2010, when an independent developer and publisher, Neo Conception, released an international version of the AES ports as part of its acquisition deal with Visco. They have since released an MVS and Neo Geo CD version, as well as a Dreamcast version in 2018. In terms of gameplay though, Bang Bang Busters is a platform game similar to Snow Bros, where as player 1 you take control of Lazy and complete 7 stages comprising of multiple levels that take place on planet Palua. The players throw energy projectiles at enemies to inflate them with air, which reminds me a lot of Dig Dug, and from there the player can take the inflated enemies to perform a variety of actions, such as launching them against other enemies in any direction, as well as float above the ground by repeatedly tapping the jump button. Defeated enemies may spawn power-ups and items, and players can take a number of enemy hits at the expense of losing power as a penalty, but the game is over after taking one last hit unless the players decide to continue playing. Personally, I thought that this game was a decent title. I am very curious why it didn't release back in the day after they developed it, but even still, I think it makes a great addition to the Neo Geo's library and doesn't really stick out as being a more modern title because of its lengthy development period. Overall, I'd give it a 7 or 8 out of 10. Crossed Swords is a hack-and-slash action RPG arcade game that was developed by Alpha Denshi and published by SNK for the Neo Geo arcade system in July 1991. In terms of gameplay, I actually found it to be similar to a couple of games, the first being The Super Spy, which I already covered as a launch title for the Neo Geo. But instead of shooting and fist fighting, you're using hack-and-slash and RPG elements such as magic. And maybe that's perhaps why I enjoyed this title a bit better. The core gameplay of this title really comes down to correct timing in battle. Knowing that the basic rule of the game is to defend first before striking will help you get through this game. Which sadly that was a bit of a learning curve for me because I was more of an offensive player first. The player wields both a weapon and a shield and can move side to side, but the playfield will move automatically. Multiple paths are available through the game, and the player has the option to skip the first and second chapters entirely at the stage select screen at the beginning. When this game released, it did receive a more mixed reception of critics, but overall it was positive. However, as I really did enjoy this game despite its flaws, I felt that it was deserving more of an 8 or 9 out of 10 than the review scores that I've seen, which average around 7 or 6.5 out of 10. I will note I may be a bit biased because I did appreciate the game's graphics showing the player as a wireframe animation, kind of like they do in the game Punch-Out in the arcades, kind of giving you a mix of the best of a first-person and third-person view. I would recommend giving this game a playthrough, and I know at some point in time I would love to play its sequel that was only released on the Neo Geo CD. Magical Drop 2 is the second in a series of video games that was developed by Data East, and that series originally debuted on their proprietary arcade hardware, but starting with this title moved over to SNK's Neo Geo. In this game, a stack of random colored bubbles descend from the top of the play screen, and if it reaches the bottom, the player loses the game. To stop this from happening, the player plays as a clown at the bottom of the screen that can grab bubbles from the descending chaos, and can hold an unlimited amount of the same colored bubble. Launching them back towards the top of the screen can cause the bubbles to burst if it creates a chain of 3 or more vertically. When that happens, any other colored bubbles that touch that chain will also disappear, and the stack will move back towards the top of the screen. A chain reaction can happen when that causes other bubbles of the same color to come in contact with each other and create another chain. As opposed to the original, a change in this game is that special bubbles that descend down can now be matched together as well. Solo mode takes up the entire screen, where if you play as 2-player, it will have the screen cut in half. That is to accommodate the second player's screen. And there's a few other differences, but you kind of get the gist of it. Overall, I found this game fun in both single and 2-player mode. And that's something I can't say for a lot of other puzzle games, but as long as the core gameplay is solid and addictive enough, I feel that I can get myself behind this. This game also spawned another sequel on the Neo Geo, Magical Drop 3, and although there are some differences with this title, I didn't really find myself enjoying one over the other. So while having both may be a bit redundant, I could say either or will give you hours of enjoyment if you enjoy puzzle games where you get to have a simple concept that goes over and over again. Pop and Bounce is a puzzle game that was released in 1997 by Video System for the Neo Geo. This game looks and plays a bit like Arkanoid, where the player controls a paddle at the bottom of the screen and must bounce off a ricocheting ball in order for it to fall to the bottom. Instead of destroying bricks, though, the playfield is filled with various enemies for the player to defeat. However, in my opinion, this one is just not as fun, as I don't enjoy controlling that paddle with the joystick. I would much prefer something like a trackball, or even like the Atari 2600 paddle controllers in order to control this game. Sadly, that was game-breaking for me, leading me to not recommend this title unless, of course, you're rich and going for an entire Neo Geo collection. Puzzle Bobble, also known as Bust-A-Move, was released in 1994 as a tile-matching puzzle video game that was developed and published by Taito. The game's characters are based on the 1986 arcade game Bubble Bobble, and features a lot of characters and themes from that game. This game was originally developed for Taito's B system released in Japan, however, they used the Neo Geo MVS to release it internationally. At the start of each game, the rectangular playing arena contains a prearranged pattern of colored bubbles. At the bottom of the screen, the player controls a device called a pointer, which aims and fires bubbles up onto the rest of the screen. The goal is to match up the colors of the bubbles until you can form a chain reaction to make the bubbles explode. At that point, any other bubble that is relying on it to stay attached to the grid will also fall off the screen, leading to a lot of strategy that goes into this simple puzzle game. The objective of the game is to clear all of the bubbles from the arena without any bubble crossing the bottom line. As this game was not developed by SNK, it was available on other platforms and thus does not require you to collect it for the Neo Geo. Sadly, this was not released on the AES or the Neo Geo CD, so you'll have to spring for the MVS version and get a converter for your AES. I might recommend that though, because this game was incredibly addicting and I had a lot of fun playing it, as well as its sequel, Bust a Move Again or Puzzle Bobble 2, which does add some variations to the gameplay, characters, and themes, and would also be recommended, but again, you wouldn't have to own both, as I feel that would be a bit redundant. Neo Bomberman is an action maze arcade video game that was developed by Produce and published by Hudson Soft for the Neo Geo MVS on May 1st, 1997. Again, the Bomberman franchise got its start on other systems and not the Neo Geo, so this is again only released on the MVS. In terms of gameplay, this really isn't any different from any of the other Bomberman games, and since this video is more geared towards Neo Geo games, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail except for, yes, this is Bomberman, and it plays very well on the Neo Geo, and I had a lot of fun with it. But again, because it's on other platforms and didn't get its start here, I would recommend staying away from this one, again, unless you have millions of dollars and can afford a complete Neo Geo collection. Mr. Do initially hit arcades in 1982 and was developed by Universal. It was the first video game to be released as a conversion kit for other arcade machines. Taito published the arcade conversion kit in Japan, and the game itself is actually inspired by Namco's Dig Dug. This version, Neo Mr. Do, was produced by Visco Games in 1996, and really it just seems to be a graphical upgrade over the original. The game also includes, as you would imagine, a much more advanced soundtrack, but the core gameplay remains unchanged. And while I feel like this is a well-done title, again, I don't think it's an essential for a Neo Geo collection, unless you're either a fan of Mr. Do, or a fan of the Neo Geo, or again, one of those millionaire benefactors that are going to donate to my complete MVS collection. Last, we're going to take a look at a unique example that actually is not playable on the Neo Geo AES, at least not without some major modifications. The Irritating Maze, which is a game that lives up to its name, was released by Saurus in 1997 for the Neo Geo MVS. Unlike most games that utilize the MVS hardware, this game runs in a unique dedicated cabinet with special controls, including a trackball for movement. Basically, you have to guide this little symbol through each of the mazes without touching any of the obstacles or you die. I guess you can kind of consider the gameplay in a similar style to that of Flappy Bird, where the game can get potentially addictive if you just want to try to keep besting your friends, seeing who can get the farthest. Sadly, or thankfully I guess, depending on your perspective, this game is not playable on the Neo Geo AES as there is no official trackball controller available for it. I have seen a few forums online that show how to hook up a trackball controller to an MVS board to get this game to work, but I have not seen anyone who has developed a controller specifically for the AES so you can play this game on it. If you are aware of a trackball controller that works on this system, let me know and I will definitely give this game a shot. There were some quiz and board games that were only released in Japan, and unfortunately I can't play them because I don't read Japanese. The United States is no stranger to quiz video games that popped up in the 1980s, but I think by the 90s most of those had gone by the wayside. On the Neo Geo platform, there are a few quiz games that are available, but again, they were all only released in Japan. The first example I'm going to show of this is Quiz King of Fighters. This is the only quiz game that was released on the Neo Geo MVS, AES, as well as the Neo Geo CD. The game has a simple story where Yuri is screened before she is kidnapped, and you have to find out who is Yuri's kidnapper and what is Quiz City. Unlike the traditional fighting formula of King of Fighters, this game actually requires you to answer questions to defeat opponents. Questions can range from entertainment, sports, politics, geography, and other SNK trivia about their characters. The game itself plays similar to a board game, where each player starts by taking turns rolling a die, and then they move across the board. Again, the main problem I have with this game is the language barrier. But I have a trick that may help me play this game. In the past, I've usually set up an iPad in front of my television screen with the Google Translate app in front of it because it has the ability to live translate as you're playing. However, as you can see in my example footage here, it didn't exactly work out as I planned. I think the biggest problem here is the fast-paced gameplay. You really only have about 5 seconds to read each question, all of the answers, and answer. And that was really too fast for my iPad to keep up. The other part of this is the fact that the characters are not clearly defined. The more contrast that you have between your text and the background of the text, the better this app works, and unfortunately, they just don't have that high amount of contrast. I also played with the region settings in my Neo SD, and I was not able to find an English translation available natively in the game. Again, if you know of a ROM patch that includes an English translation, please let me know in the comments below, and I will definitely check it out and play this game further. Strangely enough, just by random guessing, I was able to win at least one battle, and I think if I kept going, maybe I could have had more success with this game, but there's really no fun in that. And there you have it. That is the majority of the platform, puzzle, RPG, and other miscellaneous games for the Neo Geo. I have to say I probably enjoy the platform games over the puzzle games just because I feel like they provide a bit more of an experience than the puzzle games would, but overall I do feel that all of these games on the platform are just too pricey for what you're gonna get out of these games. Thankfully, a lot of these were released on other platforms, so you don't have to go back and get them on the Neo Geo. And if I had to recommend just one game to get out of the slot, it would probably be Crossed Swords. Follow that up with any of the action platform games that I mentioned, and I would save most of the puzzle and maze games just for those that are hardcore dedicated to collecting for this system. Since sports games are often easily accessible to most players because they either already know the rules or have a concept of how the game actually works before they even start playing, that may be why there's such a variety of titles to choose from in this genre. In this video, we're also going to take a look at the racing games released on the platform. That said, let's go ahead and dive in.
Baseball.
Baseball Stars 2 is a two-player baseball sports arcade game that was released by SNK in 1992. The player can select from one of 18 teams across 2 leagues, the Exciting League for Beginner and Fighting League for Expert. As opposed to the original, this game put more emphasis on the graphics and the gameplay. For example, in this game you're able to change pitchers or batters, as well as power up batters which increase the size of their bat. This version of Baseball Stars 2 was very critically acclaimed upon its release, with the first issue of Game Fan reviewing the Neo Geo version, with both reviewers giving it a score in the upper 90s. Overall, I did enjoy this game over the original, so if you're going to get one over the other, I would say try this one. And this game does follow the advice I've been giving for sports games in general, which is that it's better in 2-player than in single-player.
There's the pitch. The Sydney Griffins. Let's see what they do next time.
Super Baseball.
Super Baseball 2020 is a futuristic baseball video game that was released in 1991 in Japan for the Neo Geo. This game essentially follows the rules of baseball with some upgrades for the year 2020. Some of the characters are robots, all the human characters are equipped with powerful armor, computer sensors, and jetpacks for improved offense and defense. I could walk through and tell you how the controls are in this game, but I really don't like it. I've seen review scores of this game all over the place though. Some give it close to a 2 to 3 out of 10, and others have given it a 6 to a 7 out of 10. So I think it does vary by play experience and just how into baseball you are, or just how into a futuristic alternative baseball you are. But in my opinion, this one is an easy game to skip. Football Frenzy is the only American football arcade game that was developed for the Neo Geo, and it was published by SNK in January of 1992. This game was SNK's second attempt at making an American football game after 1987's Touchdown Fever. And for the most part, this does play like what I would expect a football game to play like. I did notice while playing through the game on single-player mode that I was not able to select my defensive plays, only being able to select offensive plays. It just seems like the team automatically sets up the best defense to the team's offense. I also noticed that every time I tried to pass in a play that it got intercepted, so maybe I'm doing something wrong. This game did get a more mixed reception from critics when it was released, probably because it doesn't play a lot like the gold standard at the time this was released, John Madden Football. Overall, though, I didn't think it was a bad experience, but I wouldn't give it more than a 6 out of 10, only recommending it to those that are fans of football and wouldn't mind playing a 90s arcade style of the game.
Ready, fight! It's an interception! Outstanding! The Bullets have the ball. Ready, fight!
NASCAR.
Neo Turf Masters is a golf video game by NASCAR, the same people who produced the Metal Slug game originally, and this game was released in 1996. Those of you that have followed my channel for a while will know that I am a big fan of golf video games, and after playing this game it quickly became one of my personal favorites. Besides the high detail graphical style for the time period, this game really has good tight controls. Unlike many golf games of the era that used a 2-click swing system to determine the hook or slice of the ball, Neo Turf Master uses a single click for the power of the shot and a second for the height of the shot, with hook and slice being selected with the B and C buttons. I fully agree with the statement that this makes the game easier to pick up and play than its contemporaries. You get to pick your choice of golfer at the very beginning, each having their own different stats, and then it's off to the course. Despite the stunning visuals for the time, which I think do hold up quite well for an arcade golf game of the 1990s, it also has one of the best golf soundtracks I've ever heard, with many of them having catchy themes that don't really seem to get repetitive even though they play each hole of the golf course. It really gives it that fast-paced arcade feel without making the gameplay seem boring. It may be a bit early to say, but this game is a contender for the best sports game on the platform. It is that good in my opinion. Sadly, this game is up there in collector's value, so I ended up getting the Big Tournament Golf, which is the Japanese version of the game, for much cheaper, and I'm very happy to have this in my collection.
Flies for birdie. Player 1 stands second. This is Nancy's report.
Hole number 2, 456 yards, par 4.
Player 1 tee shot.
Good shot!
Fairway.
Stakes Winner is a horse racing arcade video game that was developed by Saurus and originally published by SNK in 1995 for the Neo Geo. In this game, you take control of any of the available horses, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, to compete against either AI opponents or other human players across multiple races. You can control your horse with the joystick to move up and down and side to side on the screen, while the action buttons are used, one controlling the reins for small accelerations that drains portions of the horse's stamina, and another for a whip for faster speeds. There are also power-ups on the track that you can collect to help improve your racing experience, and as long as you keep placing or winning races, you can continue, otherwise you have to keep pumping in more credits to keep going. Also, for players that wish to take the offensive against some of their opponents, 2 quick taps of the joystick in any direction allows the horse to push back an opponent in front of them. However, 2 quick taps on the opposite side reduces your speed. There was a sequel released the following year called Stakes Winner 2, and I had a hard time finding much of a difference between these 2 games, other than some visual and audio tweaks here and there. Otherwise, the game controls almost exactly the same as the original, leading me to suggest that if you're going to collect these titles, only one is really necessary. Both games, however, did receive around the same review scores from critics, with each one scoring about a 5 or a 6 out of 10, with mixed reviews. I would say that's about where I fall, except for I'm more or less around the 3 or 4 out of 10 because I have almost zero interest in horse racing, and I honestly didn't find myself having fun playing it at all. There's not really anything I found that was game-breaking, but nothing in this game drew my interest to it either. Street Slam is a basketball video game that was developed by Data East for the Neo Geo in 1994. The game features 3-on-3 basketball matchups with a variety of different teams. In the US version of the game, you can select a 3-player team from a selection of 10 cities within the United States. In the European and Japanese versions of the game, the cities are replaced with countries from around the world. Each team has a total of 18 points for several characteristics, including dunk points, 3-point shots, speed, and defense, each with a maximum of 8 points. Taking a look at this game, it feels to me like they were trying to make a game that could compete with NBA Jam, as there are several over-the-top moves you can make to dunk your shots. However, if I were to compare the 2 titles, this one for me definitely comes up short. Reviews of this game have been mixed to average since its release, with review scores averaging around 5 or 6 out of 10. If I were to recommend this to anyone, it would definitely be people who are fans of 90s arcade games, but there are better ones out there, available on different platforms, but as for the Neo Geo, this is the only basketball game I am aware of. More modern reviews of this game have actually been more kind to this game, so maybe it'd be worth a pickup on a modern system, but I wouldn't recommend it for everyone.
Long bomb in the basket!
Check it out, man, ain't no referee in this sport. Tip it off and you're bumping.
Cut in from the right. Kiss the rim. Super Sidekicks!
And if you haven't noticed yet, there's one sports genre I haven't covered yet out of all of these games, and that is soccer. To me, it's almost astounding how many soccer games were released for the Neo Geo, with many of them being produced by SNK, but also it seems almost every third-party developer threw their hat in the ring for a soccer game as well. I think the premier soccer franchise on this system has to be Super Sidekicks. This is a series of soccer video games that were made by SNK for the Neo Geo. The first entry in this series came out in 1992 for the MVS, and was the successor to SNK's first soccer game, Soccer Brawl. Game development was headed by Akechi Kawasaki, and this game was developed by most of the same team that worked on several projects for the Neo Geo platforms at SNK. This game is viewed down from a top-down perspective in a 2D environment with sprites. Although it follows the same gameplay as other soccer titles at the time, and most of the rules are present as well, as expected, this game opts for a more arcade-styled approach instead of a full simulation. This title features 12 teams divided into 2 groups, each which compete for the SNK Cup. If you attempt a full playthrough of the game, you will compete against all other teams in your group, and then it goes to an elimination tournament semi-final, and then finally to the final match to win the cup. This game was well received from players and critics alike upon its release. However, in more modern reviews, this game has cooled off a little bit. Overall, I still feel like this is a competent title, and one that may be enjoyed most by soccer fans, but its easy-to-learn control scheme can make it more accessible to other players. Just don't know how many people want to play a title that was designed in the 90s with soccer.
Throw in. Halftime.
Super Sidekicks 2, the World Championship.
Super Sidekicks 2, the World Championship, was released in 1994, and this game follows basically the same control scheme from the first game using a 3-button configuration for the controls, but in this game the perspective has changed just a little bit, looking like it's been tilted to the side to give you more of a 3D look, although everything is still being rendered in 2D. This game also corrected some of the design flaws in the first game, including the ability to switch the player's control during the game. The size of the goal has been made a bit smaller, and no more long shots can be taken, among a few gameplay improvements and additions. This game has 48 teams to choose from, each one divided into 6 geographical regions, and each team represents their country. As with the first game, you have to beat all of the teams in your region before facing off in the World Cup tournament. This game is one of the few sequels that I've seen that rank better than its original. It really does feel like they nailed down the gameplay here and made all the improvements necessary to make this a classic and iconic title. Review scores of this game average around 8 to 9 out of 10, and I've seen this game included in a lot of top Neo Geo games lists. I did enjoy this one better than the original, so I would definitely recommend this over the first one, as even though I have very little interest in soccer, this one did draw me in.
Super Sidekicks 3, the Next Glory!
Super Sidekicks 3, The Next Glory, was released in 1995, and a new feature in this game involves being able to personalize your player that scores goals for your team, as well as being able to keep track of it in a high score list. This is placed alongside the top teams ranking, which serves as a high score table for teams. There is now a top scorer table for individual players. This game also adds regional tournaments, in which a team from any region can enter a tournament within their own or in other regions. This game expands the number of selectable teams up to 64, and there are now 8 geographical regions to accommodate the new teams. And although I think this game plays well enough, I think my biggest criticism of this game is that it doesn't really feel like a full-blown sequel. This game feels like an early example of them just reskinning a new game and slapping on a new number. In other words, it feels just like an update to the older game rather than a full-blown new title with new features. And because of that, I feel it's a bit strange that this game got an entire remake in 1998 called Neo Geo Cup 98, The Road to the Victory, which again to me only feels like a minor update. In fact, I really was hard-pressed to see what differences were in this game. In fact, I had to do some research and I found out the only difference in this game is that the teams were changed to reflect the World Cup in 1998. So either way, I wouldn't consider any of these games essential.
SNK Football Championship.
The Ultimate 11 SNK Football Championship was released in 1998, and it is the 4th installment in the Super Sidekicks series. Again, it doesn't really feel like they've changed much here, with some of the differences being that even though you can still name your player, the individual scores are no longer kept. Regional tournaments have been eliminated and replaced with the alternate mode of SNK Football Championship. Overall, this game did receive a positive reception from critics, but ended up being less popular than its predecessors. And to me, that is no surprise. After playing these games in order, I was getting a lot of fatigue, and really not seeing any difference in the game since Super Sidekicks 2. If I were to recommend any one game out of the series, I would say 2 is my personal favorite, but you couldn't go wrong with either 2 or 3. The Ultimate 11 was really similar, and I didn't really see anything that would push me towards that one, and the first one has some flaws that I think were corrected, starting with the second game. Next, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the racing games on this platform. We've already covered Riding Hero as it was a launch title with the system, so let's go ahead and take a look at the rest. Neo Drift Out New Technology was released in 1996, and although it is the fourth in the series, it is the only one on the Neo Geo. This is an arcade-style rally racing game with an isometric perspective. And although the controls are a bit simplified, this game is just frustratingly tedious to play. Review scores of this game average around 5 out of 10, but I would put it down there as about a 2 out of 10. Mainly because I didn't find this game enjoyable whatsoever in the least, and it was a chore for me to get through. The reflex challenges combined with some of the slippery controls of the cars really didn't go over well with me, so I honestly could not recommend this to anyone for the system, unless you're getting it as a display piece for your collection, because this is not what I see you coming back to play very often.
Great finish!
Overtop is a racing arcade video game developed by ADK and published by SNK in 1996. It is the spiritual successor to Thrash Rally, which was released earlier in 1991. And to describe how this game plays? Oh no, it's another isometric perspective top-down game. I'm just going to go ahead and say I am not a fan at all of these games. This is just a dated playstyle that we only put up with because of a system that couldn't do 3D graphics. Some people may find these nostalgic, but I really don't. And in terms of playing this game, I was kind of surprised. Upon my first playthrough of this game, I was able to beat it on easy difficulty with no issues whatsoever. The controls of this game are simplified just like in Neo Drift Out, but I feel like the cars themselves control so much better. Or maybe I just picked the right one right from the get-go and didn't realize it. I will note that this game uses a checkpoint system in which the player will gain extra time by reaching a tunnel at the end of each location, and each time you reach a checkpoint you gain more time, but if you run out of time before you reach the checkpoint, that's where your run ends. This game has received mixed reception from critics and reviewers since its release, and I've seen it ranked at around a 3 to 6 out of 10, but to be honest, I was actually kind of surprised by this one. I didn't feel like it was excellent by any means, but it was one of the better top-down racers with an isometric perspective that I've ever played. So if you feel like you have to try out one of these games, this is the one I'd recommend. And just to take a quick look at the original game, Thrash Rally, this is again from a top-down perspective, and it was released in 1991 for the Neo Geo, making it an early game title. And again, this game controls okay. I didn't find myself enjoying it as much as Overtop, but this game did receive better review scores upon its release. And I think that's because this style of game was more common back in the early 90s, so it was back when this kind of format was more acceptable. I think this is a decent and competent title, but again not one that I really enjoyed, so I can't really recommend it. I've seen review scores average around 8 out of 10 for this, but I would definitely give it more of like a 4 or a 5 out of 10. Well, that'll about wrap up the sports and racing games released for the Neo Geo. I didn't cover every single game, but I did cover a lot of them. I think overall, sports games from this system are going to be very dated due to the system's limitations when compared to games of the modern day. The only games that I feel like aged well on this system are Neo Turf Masters and Super Sidekicks. Every other sports game on this system, really I wouldn't consider essential. So most of these games, in my opinion, are just going to be well suited to being display pieces in your collection, rather than ones you'll actually go back and play very often. But again, that is just my opinion, coming from the fact that I don't really enjoy a lot of retro sports games, because I feel like sports games are mainly products of their time, and because there are better ways to play them today, they become dated a lot more quickly than some of the other titles. I feel the same way with racing games, as those are games that are typically ones that push the systems to their theoretical limits, and the Neo Geo comes up short as well, I think with the biggest hindrance being that they can't generate 3D graphics. Maybe if they would have done a game more similar to something like Pole Position, maybe with that rasterized graphic effect, as I think that's the one they used in Riding Hero, which was a launch title, maybe I would have liked those a bit better, but I'm not a fan of top-down racers. But anyway, that is just my opinion. I'm sure many of you may agree or disagree with my opinions in the comments below. Go ahead and let me know what your experiences have been with these games, or if you haven't played any of these, let me know in the comments which ones are more interesting to you to try.
Well, this is finally it. We are on to the last part. I'm going to talk about the legacy of SNK and the Neo Geo. So if you're just arriving here at the end for the first time, I would definitely recommend going back and watching at least the first part of this review before watching this part, because it should help you make more sense out of what I'm going to talk about in this video. With that said, as I remind you to click that like and subscribe button and the bell icon to be notified when I make future posts, let's go ahead and get started.
When the Neo Geo AES initially released in Japan, it was only meant for rental or in use in hotels. However, SNK quickly began selling the system through stores when customer response indicated that people were willing to spend the money on the home version of the console. When the Advanced Entertainment System launched in the United States, it debuted at $599, coming with 2 controllers and a game, either Baseball Stars Professional or NOM 1975. The console would sell very modestly due to its high price, but because it shared the same hardware as the arcade versions, there was little expense to port the games to the home system. Besides the initial cost of the console at launch, each additional game would retail for at least $200, which as of 2022 would be almost $400 each. To help combat the high cost of entry into the Neo Geo market, SNK came up with a solution using CDs. The compact disc, which was seen as the future of video games rather than cartridges, had a large advantage over cartridges being several times cheaper to produce. The Neo Geo CD would debut on September 9th, 1994 in Japan, and would feature the same games that were on the Neo Geo MVS and AES. However, CDs would retail for much less than the cartridges, retailing for around $50 to $80. The Neo Geo CD console can also play audio CDs, and all of them have no region lock, allowing you to play any region's game on the system. The Neo Geo CD also came with a control pad instead of a joystick like the AES. However, the original AES joystick can be used with all 3 Neo Geo CD models. The problem with this system is that it came a bit too late, not even launching in the United States until January 15, 1996, well into the next generation of home video games. One review in late 1995 noted that SNK's reputation for fun games made the system worth a look. However, they argued their failure to upgrade the Neo Geo system with 3D capabilities would keep them from producing any truly cutting-edge games. Overall, that review ended with giving the system a 1.5 out of 5 stars. About a year after its launch, the system would be discontinued. As their hardware was beginning to look aged in the arcades as well, SNK developed a new system known as the Hyper Neo Geo 64. This system would feature a 64-bit CPU, as well as 3D graphics capability, and they would release it in 1997 as the successor to the MVS within the Neo Geo family. However, the initial launch of the system was met with very mixed reception. One of the first games released for the system, Samurai Showdown 64, was not well received by gamers and fans of the franchise. SNK would go on to produce 7 different titles for the system, but none of them became a huge hit, leading them to discontinue the system altogether in 1999. It was stated that if the system was successful, that they would have created a home version just like they did with the AES and MVS. However, that never materialized. SNK would continue to try to move their brand forward by making the Neo Geo Pocket, which is a monochrome handheld video game system that was released by SNK on October 28, 1998 in Japan. This handheld would launch later in Europe, however the initial system would never make it to the United States. The Neo Geo Pocket is considered to be an unsuccessful console due to lower than expected sales that resulted in its discontinuation the following year in 1999.
It's here! The revolutionary Neo Geo Pocket Color! With 16-bit power, revolving joystick, 146 color display, 6 cool styles. The graphics will blow you away. Neo Geo Pocket, way ahead of the game.
However, the system was immediately followed up by the Neo Geo Pocket Color. This handheld debuted March 16th of 1999 in Japan and hit store shelves in North America that August. The system started off with strong sales in both the US and Japan. Part of that is credited to its launch lineup, which had a record-breaking 14 titles launching with the handheld. However, that success was short-lived as sales immediately began to taper off with a lack of retail support in the United States. Part of this was due to lack of communication with third-party developers by SNK's American management, as well as the popularity of Nintendo's Pokémon franchise that was burning up the sales charts on the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. There was also rumors of Nintendo's next system being close to a Super Nintendo handheld, which made the Neo Geo Pocket Color begin to look dated almost at launch. Around this time, after having released 3 systems that were commercial failures, SNK was in financial trouble. That same year, in 1999, Neo Geo World Tokyo Bayside was opened in Pallet Town, Tokyo. It would be equipped with attractions such as Ferris wheels and roller coasters. In the end, the amusement park business would be a huge failure that wasted management's time and energy as well as the company's resources. Add to that in the late 1990s that the boom of 2D fighting games, which SNK had been using as a money-printing machine since the early 90s, was on the decline. SNK's attempts to break out of the 2D fighting game genre had also been unsuccessful, and because the company's structure was designed to rely on income from these failing franchises, the company kept sinking further into debt. In January of 2000, SNK's poor financial status led to its acquisition by Aruze, a company known for its pachinko machines. Instead of developing video games using SNK's intellectual properties, Aruze manufactured pachinko machines that featured popular series such as The King of Fighters. That year, Capcom had agreed to create a series of fighting games featuring both companies' fighting game characters, known as Capcom vs. SNK. However, the agreement left most of the profits with Capcom due to the fact that they would both develop and publish the game. With the declining revenues of the video game industry, SNK would close all American operations on June 13, 2000. The company sold its distribution rights in North America for the MVS arcade system, as well as its American localizations of some console releases, to outside companies. With low morale and an unclear future, many of the company's employees left their jobs. Some would go and join rival Capcom, and some banded together to form a new company known as Brezasoft, which would continue to develop Neo Geo games, such as The King of Fighters 2001. Seeing the end of SNK, founder Akechi Kawasaki left SNK along with other executives to found a company named Playmore on August 1st, 2001. Then, on October 22, 2001, SNK filed for bankruptcy and put the rights to SNK's intellectual property up for sale. Licenses for SNK's game production and development rights for its franchises were sold to several other companies. Some of these included Eolith, which produced the King of Fighters franchise between 2001 and 2002, as well as Mega Enterprise, which would go on to create Metal Slug 4. It was around this time when the Neo Geo Pocket Color was officially discontinued and unsupported, being the last console that SNK would produce. Despite its failure, the Neo Geo Pocket Color has been regarded as a highly influential system. Many acclaimed games were released for the system, such as SNK vs. Capcom, Match of the Millennium, King of Fighters R2, and other quality arcade titles derived from SNK's MVS and AES. Many praised its arcade-style microswitch clicky joystick, as well as the system's display and 40-hour battery life. It really seemed like the end of SNK was at hand. However, in an effort to regain control of SNK, Kawasaki's new company Playmore successfully bid and was awarded SNK's IP rights on October 30th, 2001. The company then began to bolster its assets and rehire former SNK employees. To re-establish its presence in the gaming market, Playmore acquired Brezasoft and some of its former SNK developers, including Japan-based Neo Geo developer Noise Factory. SNK also acquired Sun Amusement, which was a Japanese commercial games distributor, to help them get a presence back in the gaming market. International offices were established in South Korea, Hong Kong, and the United States under the name SNK Neo Geo. On July 7, 2003, all of the acquired entities were consolidated into SNK Playmore. That was after they had retrieved the rights from Aruze to use the name SNK. Previously, ADK, or Alpha Denshi, was a third-party company that had been heavily associated with SNK since the late 1980s. However, also in 2003, SNK would purchase ADK shortly after it filed for bankruptcy. Even after acquiring back the IP rights from Aruze, they continued to use some of those IPs to make money, and that didn't sit well with Ikechi Kawasaki. In October of 2002, they would sue Aruze for infringing on their acquired intellectual property rights. The lawsuit would end in January of 2004, with an Osaka District Court favoring SNK Playmore, awarding it 5.64 billion yen, or $44.9 million. Once they had arranged themselves into SNK Playmore, they went on the warpath, creating an injunction against a group of 4 different companies, who were then illegally manufacturing hundreds of AES cartridges. However, in the wake of the new company, that same year, SNK Playmore would discontinue the AES system, preferring to publish video games in cooperation with Sammy, using its new Adamus Wave arcade board. Shortly afterward, with the final games coming out, the Neo Geo would end its initial reign in 2004. In 2004, SNK Playmore would become officially licensed to manufacture Japanese slot machines, and they would continue to use their intellectual properties on those machines to increase revenue. Although they would never get close to the volume of games that released during their heyday, SNK Playmore would go on to produce arcade games on other arcade platforms not designed by themselves. They also turned their focus to porting some of their previous game library to other systems, such as the PlayStation 2, Nintendo DS, and mobile phones. In 2007, SNK Playmore USA released its first game on the Xbox Live Arcade online platform, titled Fatal Fury Special. SNK Playmore also began supporting Nintendo's Virtual Console service on the Wii, with Fatal Fury, Art of Fighting, and World Heroes being initial offerings. It was through these services that many would finally get a chance to play a lot of the Neo Geo titles on a home console. And it is with these actions that I firmly believe that Neo Geo started getting a resurgence in popularity. The previous generation of gamers were happy to see that they were finally able to play an affordable version of the arcade games they used to play back in the day. However, a new generation of gamers were also discovering these titles for the first time. In 2007, the King of Fighters 11 was released on the PlayStation 2, and in 2009 they would release the King of Fighters 12, which was not as well received until the new King of Fighters 13, which allowed the franchise to live on modern platforms. In December of 2012, SNK Playmore released the Neo Geo X, which was a relaunched mobile Neo Geo platform. It was the first Neo Geo system to be released since the discontinuation of the brand in 2004. but it would be their third Neo Geo handheld device, following the 1999 release of the Neo Geo Pocket Color. The system initially launched as part of a bundle called the Neo Geo X Gold Edition, which included a docking station, arcade stick, and a bonus game card. The docking station is modeled after the original AES console and is used for charging the handheld as well as connecting it to a television, similar to what you would see on the Nintendo Switch years later. The publication Consumer Reports recommended the system for enthusiasts of older games, but criticized the device's video quality on modern televisions. On October 2, 2013, SNK Playmore terminated its licensing agreement with the console manufacturer Tomo, effectively ending production of the Neo Geo X less than a year after its release. Tomo would dispute the termination of their contract, stating that the contract was to be in effect until 2016, and that it performed every obligation to the licensing agreement. There is conflicting information about what actually led to the contract termination, but many seem to think that it was due to disappointment out of the console manufacturer's quality standards.
Dun, 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 dun. Dun, 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 dun.
As part of SNK's 40th anniversary celebration, they released a Neo Geo Mini console, which was a dedicated miniature home arcade console that was designed to look like the initial Neo Geo MVS system, but would include mostly AES versions of the games. The game can be played by itself, or it can be hooked up to an HD television via a mini HDMI port, and the console featured 40 games built in, but everything was accomplished through emulation. In April of 2016, SNK officially dropped Playmore from their name and its corporate logo, and introduced its old slogan, "The Future Is Now," to signify a return to SNK's rich gaming history. It was at this time the company began to shift more towards its game franchises, more so than it had in the past decade. A new King of Fighters, Samurai Showdown, and new games in the Metal Slug series have been announced. The impact and legacy of SNK and the Neo Geo almost cannot be overstated. Several game franchises derived first on the Neo Geo, including Sengoku, the King of Fighters, Last Blade, Super Sidekicks, Art of Fighting, Metal Slug, and several others. And since its discontinuation, the popularity of the Neo Geo seems to continue on. Homebrew on the system, both commercially and privately, seemed to start as soon as the hardware was discontinued. Many hardcore video game collectors consider the Neo Geo one of the holy grails of their collection, and many consider it to be the most challenging console to collect for. Because most cartridges had a limited production run, some of the rarest Neo Geo games can sell for well over $10,000 a piece. The MVS market provides a cheaper alternative to expensive home AES cartridges, and they can be used on the AES through the use of adapters.
So in terms of my experience with the Neo Geo, I first learned about this system when I read Stephen L. Kent's The Ultimate History of Video Games, and I was very intrigued by this hybrid arcade and home system. I knew for a fact that back in the day, I would never have been able to afford this. My parents just wouldn't spring that for a console at that time. In fact, the first console I remember my parents getting was the 3-in-1 Nintendo Entertainment System that was heavily discounted towards the end of its life. I was actually kind of surprised that they got the Super Nintendo Entertainment System when it launched, because that just seemed uncharacteristic of my parents not to try to save more money with that. But since then, it's kind of been this mythical, kind of holy grail of console collecting. I've always been on the lookout for one just to see one in person, if not be able to collect it. And for 20 years, I did not find anything more about this system, and I had never seen one in person. That is until of December of 2019, when the Retro Game Store in my area posted that they had one in stock, and it was first come, first serve. I rushed over there as quickly as I could to get it. I got there, the store clerk pulled it out from the case, we tried it out for a little bit, we played a little bit of King of Fighters 94 on it, and I had enough money to cover the entire cost of the system, plus the games they had, so I bought it. And I was very excited to be able to get it. I knew that I wanted to cover it on this channel in huge, in-depth coverage, because nobody that I know personally, at least who's ever told me about it, never had one of these consoles. And it's something that when I tell people about it, they're like, no way did they make an arcade system for your house. And oh, I would have loved to have had that. So it's been a particular thrill for me to be able to get it. The games that I got with it were games like Nom 1975, King of Fighters 94, but that was pretty much it. It was only then that I realized, after getting the system, how expensive it is to collect for it. I assumed there was going to be some around the $100 mark, $200 mark, and that this would be a rare treat for me to get one. Maybe I could ask for ones for Christmas and whatnot. But it wasn't until I tried to collect Metal Slug for the system that I realized, holy cow, is this expensive on a whole nother level. So I knew I was going to have to go on the cheap, and thankfully I learned what the NVS was. When I first bought the Neo Geo AES, I just thought it was called the Neo Geo. I didn't know the NVS was different cartridges for the arcade. I just thought it all ran the same thing and all the games were the same. I also learned that if you get a converter, you can use the cheaper NVS cartridges on your AES, so that's the route I thought I was going to go with this. Trying to go the route of getting a 161 in one cart wasn't as easy either. These cartridges are expensive for the AES as well when compared to their NVS counterparts. So I got an NVS 161 in one cart, and I got a converter so that it would work on my AES, and for the most part I was able to get it working, but each time I had to power off the system and power it back on multiple times to get it to work, and a light bulb clicked off in my head saying I probably shouldn't be torturing my very expensive Neo Geo console like this, so I decided to put that off to the side, and I haven't used it since. Maybe if I get a consoleized NVS in the future, I'll be able to use that cartridge and utilize it correctly more often, but for now, I'm not going to risk damaging my AES trying to get that thing to work. So then that left me with the brilliant developers over at Stone Age Gamer who developed the Neo SD cart. This thing is the reason why I've been able to bring you the ultimate Neo Geo review, rather than here are the just 5 or 6 games I've been able to find in the last couple years for it. But another thing that this does that I was not expecting is that it actually gives me access to the North American versions of these games. My console is the Japanese region console, which is cheaper to collect, but it also will display things in Japanese by default unless I modify the BIOS chip. And I have very little interest in doing a hardware modification to the system. I'd like to keep it as stock as I possibly can. But with all that said, with the high price of collecting, the multi-carts that don't really seem to work well on it, and the high expense of getting the Neo SD, I still love getting this system. And in fact, I still do plan to collect cartridges for this game, even though I have access to the full library. It's just the priority has been lowered by a lot. Am I ever going to get that Metal Slug game? Probably not. But I will be able to get a variety of games that I enjoy on this console. In fact, the only thing missing from my collection now is a second Neo Geo, because I would love to sometime be able to showcase that 2-player gameplay where you can have one player playing on one TV and one player playing on another. That would be something I would love to try out, but I mean, it took me 20 years to find the first console. Maybe in another 20 years, I'll be able to show you that when I find the other and another copy of the game to play on it. But with all that said, with all those complications and all those drawbacks, at the end of the day, I still love this console. Having the Neo Geo AES really makes me feel like I have a 1990s arcade unit at my disposal 24/7, and that is an awesome feeling. Especially since I grew up in the 90s, I've played a lot of these games in the arcade, and I played a bunch of them on the Wii. There is nothing quite like playing it on original hardware and on a CRT. These games look absolutely stunning and fascinating on a CRT. They utilize a lot of tricks that aren't emulated well and don't show up well on modern displays, even with that awesome upscaler that I have, the Retrogaming 5X. And out of everything else, when I see these games on a CRT, especially next to other home consoles of the time, this just blows those experiences out of the water with their constant visuals, high-fidelity graphics, and the sound chip in this console, which I grew very fond of all throughout my playthrough of it. I mean, it's just everything about this system I really like. At the end of the day, though, would I recommend collecting one? Absolutely not. This is definitely very high up there on the hardcore collector's list. The barrier to entry for collecting for this system is quite high. You definitely have to have a lot of resources to invest in the system, not just monetarily, but also skill-wise if things go wrong. In this case, this is going to be one of the few times you hear me say this, Emulation is the preferred option for most people to experience this console. And I know with that statement, I've probably made a few enemies out there who were really liking my Neo Geo review, but it's absolutely the truth, because it is just not feasible for everyone who wants to play these games to get the original hardware. It's a lot less accessible than the more popular game consoles out there. Even the TurboGrafx, which didn't sell as well as like your Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis, that thing is much more accessible than this console is. So in that case, I just can't recommend it for that purpose. At the end of the day, I would have loved to have had one of these back in the day. It was a kid's dream to be able to own one of these back in the day, and I would have loved to have one then. I love having one now. This is a console I will be pulling out probably more frequently than the rest because of its uniqueness, because of that 90s arcade experience that it provides, and I just can't be more happy. I would give the Neo Geo a thumbs up. That said, that does end this video series here, and I am now done with the Neo Geo for the 16-bit war. And before we start the 16-bit war, I have one more system to cover, and that is the Super Nintendo. So stay tuned for that series coming out to you real soon with the Ultimate Super Nintendo review.
If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A special thanks to those Patreons you see on screen. Also, if you like what you see, please remember to leave a like and click that subscribe button on your way out. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.